Good morning and welcome to day 2 of AdvaMed's PMA submissions workshop. My name is Noah Cohen. I am with the AdvaMed conferences and events team, and I'll be your host for the program today. I have a few reminders before we get started. The troubleshooting and information guide that was posted yesterday is again located in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to refer to it throughout the day if necessary. Attendee microphones are muted by default during the program. We will again hold dedicated Q&A sessions between every 2 to 3 sessions. However, if you have a question during a presentation, please use the raise your hand, chat, or Q&A features located at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, as we did yesterday, we will adhere to the schedule as closely as possible to ensure everyone can take advantage of the planned breaks throughout the day. With that said, let's get started with day 2. Our first topic today is inspection activity, and we are pleased to welcome Jacob Dyer from the FDA. Jacob, thanks for getting us started today.
Thank you very much, Noah. Just going to share my screen. And can I just confirm that everybody can see my screen?
Yep, it looks good.
Okay, excellent. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Lieutenant Commander Jake Dyer. I'm a Senior Regulatory Officer with the FDA in the within CDRH under the Product of Evaluation and Quality, then within the Office of Regulatory Programs, then within the Division of Establishment Support, and then finally into the Medical Device Single Audit Program and Regulatory Inspections Audit Team. So that's we like acronyms here, so we try to put as many in there as we possibly can. So today I'm going to go through pre-approval inspections in that process. A little bit about my background. I was a field investigator and device specialist for FDA prior to being within CDRH, and then now responsible for the medical device single audit program and regulatory inspection side. So as you've heard in previous presentations, PMA has multiple steps in the progression. The step that we're going to talk about now is the on-site check, that inspection that occurs, mainly of the quality system regulation and then the controls that you have in place for your PMA submission. We're going to cover the background on PMA inspections, the different types of submissions, and the FDA review milestones along that process. The submission types, the pre-approval inspection process itself, a little bit about the FDA review process as it pertains to the inspections, and then some tips around the inspection to help make sure that you prepare for the inspection, and then kind of some tips and steps for after the inspection as well. So within the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, you're going to find the PMA information around pre-approval and post-market to include inspections in some various places. So I wanted to provide just kind of an overview of where those are. So 814 is going to cover pre-market approval of medical devices. It's going to have the procedures for review of PMA. It's going to have that with the FDA inspections that in compliance with 820. And then it also has provisions for HDE devices, which we'll talk about a little bit. And that's in 814, 116. And then there's the compliance program manual, which guides the PMA pre-approval and then the PMA post-market inspection. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those would be. So what triggers an inspection within your PMA? So typically an original pre-market approval would warrant that. When I think it's talked about modules in previous sessions, they'd be inspected after it's converted to a PMA. If you have a site change and those supplements, that's a lot of times will trigger a new inspection request. And then, as we talked about in the last slide, the humanitarian device exemptions, and those are where we see their ailments affect less than 200,000 people a year. Typically, there's a shorter time to review, and the inspections oftentimes happen a little bit earlier in the process. And then submissions where the facility has a current official action indicated or OAI classification. To clear a lot of those classifications and those issues, there's oftentimes a follow-up inspection that takes shape. And these assignments are really there, and they're issued after the manufacturer has demonstrated in the PMA application that both the design controls and the manufacturing process controls have been adequately established. So the key is this happens after there's already been a review. You've already submitted the documentation, and then it's a in many cases a verification. You've already cleared all the discrepancies that have occurred. So the major steps in this process. So if we look at the first star, within about 30 days of the process, you're going to be at a point where there's been a determination for a need for a pre-approval inspection. And that's kind of where we are in this first star. And that's going to be done through CDRH and OPEC. So going to the next step, so within the next 8-week time period, the on-site inspection should be scheduled and completed. And then 30 days after that, the draft establishment inspection report is drafted. So the EIR, the establishment inspection report, will be completed within that 30-day window. Once that 30-day window and the EIR has been completed, then CDRH and OPEC are going to review and classify the EIR, and then they'll come out with a PMA recommendation. And we'll talk through each of these steps in a little bit more detail. Okay, as I mentioned before, FDA utilizes pre-approval inspections to determine that the device and the manufacturing facilities, methods, and controls are in place. And I say it's very important to, when I say in place. So everything else was reviewed based upon documents coming in, and oftentimes it's some of these validation activities, especially process validations, this is what we're going to do. But they need, by the time that the inspection comes, they have to have been done, and it needs to be in a fully kind of operational environment. It's important that these controls match those specified within the PMA application and the requirements of the quality system regulation. Inspections are going to occur. So one, when the information submitted demonstrates that the quality system implemented on site appears to be in compliance with 21 CFR 820, and any major deficiencies have been adequately addressed. And then thirdly, the site needs to indicate that they're ready for that pre-approval inspection. And I, on the second item, I kind of talked about major deficiencies. So minor can be worked through interactively through the review process, and there is a possibility that the investigator can gather the necessary information during the inspection on site, but that's going to be case to case, and you'll know that prior to an inspection being pushed forward. It's also possible that the determination of a pre-approval inspection is not required. Sometimes if your facility has already been inspected and it's been determined to be acceptable, and the benefit risk-based approach for this determines that a pre-approval inspection is not required, you may not need one, but that will be on a case-by-case basis. And so the key is to ensure that you have identified all facilities that are used in the manufacture of the device in your submission, and that all these sites are also ready for the inspection. And this includes, as I mentioned earlier, that complete process validation of activities. If you have multi-site, especially with design centers that are often used at maybe a centralized location, they should probably be included as part of the pre-approval inspection. And then I can't stress it enough that you need to ensure that you're ready with production process validation. So we need to be beyond the bench samples and the engineering samples and actually into what are the controls and manufacturing controls and design controls that you're using day in and day out. So who conducts these pre-approval inspections? So it's going to be different depending on if it's a domestic or foreign. So domestic inspections are going to be completed by one of the three divisions based on where you're at and investigators from that area. Foreign are going to be coordinated through CDRH, and CDRH is quote unquote the home district or the home division in this case for all the processing. So it's a little bit different depending on where you're at, not too far away from a normal EIR type of inspection. So these inspections from that 30-day mark when a pre-approval inspection's kind of indicated, you're looking at about 8 weeks for domestic and about 10 weeks for foreign for scheduling, and that's the goal. And there's always other factors that go in. As we noted before, and you're going to probably hear it many times, that the facility needs to be ready. So delays in process validations or manufacturer location changes, especially in the last minute, can really delay this time frame. While previous medical device single audit program, MDSAP audits, as well as ISO 13485 audits provide information to the reviewers, they are not intended to replace FDA pre-approval inspections. So you might be a participant in MDSAP. However, those audits are not a replacement for a pre-approval inspection. And then we did talk about the time frame for the investigators to have additional 30 days to complete the inspection. The determination of which sites that are going to need to be inspected is going to come through the review process when the request with your review team. So a little bit outside of the inspection, but you'll know that when the inspection, when you're notified about the inspection. And that kind of is somewhat of a segue into here, where the process kind of as the pre-approval inspections come down is CDRH and specifically the reviewer will create the inspection assignment, and that will have what locations are part of that assignment. The FDA investigator who receives that assignment will pre-announce, and that's usually right at 5 calendar days. Will pre-announce that inspection. This pre-announcement's really for the manufacturer to make sure that they have all the staff on site and all the required records to be available during the inspection. So that's really important. So for example, if you have a design center that you outsource to, it's incredibly important that you make sure that you have the DHF in-house and you have access to it at a moment's notice. And as I said before, that inspection's not going to be issued until the manufacturing deficiencies that were annotated during the submission are already worked through. And I did say that some, especially that's true for the major, or some of the minor, they may still do the request and work interactively to resolve those other issues, or have the investigator follow up on them in person, depending on what it is. So the pre-approval inspections is a quality system inspection. It's based on the QSIT approach. In this case, it's going to be a baseline or a level 2 comprehensive inspection. And that means it's going to cover all 4 major subsystems. And those are management controls, design controls, CAPA, and production and process controls. While these devices are not marketed yet, you're sometimes limited in some of the CAPA areas, and we'll talk through that a little bit. So again, it's making sure that procedures and systems have been adequately established. And that's a very, very key word, and I'd like to just touch on it again. Establish has a very unique definition. It includes define, document, and implement. And so all too often, there's a piece of paper that has the procedure on it, but if it's not being utilized and it's not implemented, it hasn't been established. So just a key point there. Whenever we talk about all these things, that making sure that they're put into play. Again, all process validations have been completed, and that's you're going to keep hearing that as a common theme, just because it's an often overlooked item. And then we want to make sure manufacturing conditions are adequate to process that through. So if a manufacturer has their PMA devices designed under contract, the manufacturer must maintain or have readily available copies of the design history file and control the suppliers under 820.50. Those verification activities need to be completed as part of the design controls, and there shouldn't be any new changes that weren't originally reported in regards to design previously. And then around production and process controls, we need to make sure processes are validated, as I said, processes are in control, and then that you have those controls on those suppliers as we talked about for the design controls. So in addition to those 4 major subsystems, we kind of broke out 3 more that need to be looked at or will be looked at. The material controls, the record document and change controls, and equipment and facility controls. I mean, oftentimes, if you've ever been through FDA inspection, you're going to spend a lot of time in complaint handling and adverse event reporting through medical device reporting and MDR. However, if it's not marketed, those things aren't really there to be viewed. Okay, so tips for success. Like, how can you be successful during these pre-approval inspections? So I think with everything, it's being cordial and cooperative. It's an effort to help make sure that the safety and effectiveness of devices are there. So making sure a photocopy machine is available. So investigators will be collecting documents. So you want to make sure that you have the ability to print and or copy those documents for the investigators, because they're going to be taking evidence with them when they go. It's important to know what the investigator's looking at and what exhibits they've collected. So document what they've covered, and then anything that the investigator's talking about. Those are key items to work on or to talk through as you build out your responses. And provide information and records that are clear and responsive to the questions from the investigator. So try to as forthcoming as you can be, and then document what information they've collected. So you know exactly what evidence was collected. It helps you know what they use to make their determinations for discussions, for 43 items, and then also within the inspection report itself that the reviewer is going to be looking at after the inspection is over. Okay, so tips for during the pre-approval inspection. Can't say this enough, is to request a meeting at the end of each day. Talk about what was looked at, talk about any concerns that the investigator had, any potential items that need to be addressed, because some of them, maybe they just didn't have the documents, or there was a misunderstanding with what they asked for, and that you still have time to provide those documentation if it's already in place. And again, it's already established, it's already implemented. So based on initial findings, start to prepare those responses and corrections. So as you hear about those things, you can start to do a little bit more research, and maybe there are other documents in place or other things in place that actually address that. If you get the corrections completed during the inspection, you can have the investigator annotate the FDA 43. This is really important because if it's already corrected, it becomes less of an issue when it's reviewed. Still an observation, but if it can be shown that it was already completed and corrected, or at least that there's a promise to correct, it makes it a little bit the willingness of the manufacturer to make good on those observations. And it's real important too, if there's questions or concerns that you about the investigators, those ORA divisions or CDRH is a point that you can come out to. And you'll when the investigator shows up, they're going to provide you with contact information to follow up as part of the opening meeting. So what happens at the end of the inspection? So at the completion of the FDA inspection, the FDA investigator may issue a form FDA 43, which lists significant inspectional observations. And they're going to do that to the most responsible person at the site at the time of the closeout inspection. So what's important is other observations may be discussed verbally with the site at the end of the inspection. Incredibly important to respond to both of them. So both the observations on the FDA 43 as well as discussion items. I've seen in my personal experience that discussion items alone were significant enough to hold up a PMA approval. So it's important to make sure that you're addressing both as we go through. And then the EIR along with the FDA 43 is issued, and any supporting documentation and exhibits is forwarded to CDRH for review and final classification. So that's going to help you if you make sure that you know what was collected. It's going to help you know what the CDRH reviewer is also looking at whenever they're making their decision. And we talked about inspection classification. I'm going to go through them briefly here. So the inspection can be classified in three ways. Is NAI, which is no action indicated. And that's when there's really no objectionable conditions found during that inspection, nothing that's significant to really justify any further action. There's VAIs, voluntary action indicated. There's going to be, so a 43 was issued, but they don't meet a threshold for regulatory action. So these are things that need to be corrected. If they would continue to be repeated, maybe it would have more regulatory action to it. But these are things that the manufacturer should address, and then but it should not hold on anything up. And then OAIs, official action indicated. These are usually significant objectionable conditions and really need to be considered, or at least a recommendation for regulatory action to be taken. So the most severe, and usually these will hold up, still hold up a PMA at least until they're cleared. A question that just came in was around, is a 43 still issued with an NAI classification? Typically not. It doesn't mean it. Usually you'll see when it's NAI, it's more discussion based. So it doesn't mean that there was no objectionable conditions. They just probably weren't significant enough to be on a 43. I think in all the cases I've seen, if a 43 is issued, it takes it to the VAI level. So I don't think that we would really see a 43 issued with an NAI. But I guess it could potentially happen depending on how they would classify it. If they didn't think the 43 items were appropriate during the review and classification of that EIR. So that would probably be the only time I could really think of it. Okay, so points to consider after inspection. So we just talked about, we just went through classifications, and prior to that talked about how your, if a 43 is issued. So if a 43 is issued, it is highly recommended that you respond in writing to the observations. and the items that are discussed verbally. So I did talk about that a little bit. I would always do both. And you want to make sure, typically it's 15 days to get it in is the rule of thumb. You don't have to do it at all, but it's highly recommended. In addition to that, the sooner you get it in and the more thorough your response is, because these go into the consideration for the evaluation before the inspection is classified. So adequate responses may have a favorable impact on the final classification. If there's a thought that it's going to be taken care of, there's a well thought out plan, the risk goes down. So everything is done through that risk lens. So 4 items that you want to make sure that are in your written response. You want to make sure that the assessment of the root cause of the problem, so not just the symptoms, so not just the containment, but how do you stop this from happening in the future? The evaluation of the extent of the problem, so the research on the problem. What containment actions, what corrections, what corrective actions, what systemic corrective actions, and then what is the timeline that you're going to be able to put this in place? And that's all going to be incredibly important as we go forward, especially for any follow-up work that needs to be done. And then what supporting documentation do you have to show that you've done this work? This is your next steps, and how would you tackle it? I kind of look at it as a manufacturer looks at it as kind of these parts is, we see the issue, we understand what the issue is, and then this is what we're going to do to fix that issue. So after the inspection, so areas that you probably want to reach back out and request a meeting with the reviewer would be if there's substantial and significant observations. So many observations and pretty significant issues. You probably want to have that conversation to talk through it, especially if there's major disagreements or misunderstandings with these. So either you don't agree with what the investigator said or presented, or the investigator didn't understand it correctly. There was a misunderstanding between the two. I think those are areas that you probably need to reach out and have a meeting, and then, or if it's incredibly complex, very novel process ideas, manufacturing ideas, there might have been a misunderstanding, or the right documents may not have been looked at. So those are items. If it's not easily explainable, it's probably worth at least requesting a meeting if it's significant and you can foresee that it's going to hold things up. So the PMA approval process. So CDRH and OPEC will consider to recommend approval when the manufacturing information has been reviewed and and determined to be acceptable. The inspections have been completed, and the EIRs have been reviewed and classified as VAI or NAI. So the PMA approval is not recommended when inspection is classified as OAI. And so OAI situations typically gets an OAI PMA letter, and once the deficiencies are addressed, then there'll be a follow-up inspection to clear. It may or may not have a follow-up inspection. And then there's also a approvable pending GMPs where everything else looks good except they just need the PMA inspection. And sometimes that's the manufacturer's just not ready yet, and it's kind of on hold until it goes through. So it's you get instead of an approval, you get approvable letter, and then it's with a pending GMPs. Okay, so everything we've talked about thus far has really been on the pre-approval side of the house. And so the other part of this is the post-approval inspection for PMAs. So post-approval inspections typically scheduled about 8 to 12 months after the approval. So by this point, the device is marketed. The inspection is going to primarily focus on any changes that have been made into the design or manufacturing processes. So what's different from when we were there for the pre-approval? Now there's data, potentially adverse event reporting, complaint handling. So now we're going to look at compliance with the MDR regulations. And so now CAPA becomes a little bit larger because you're producing more of this device. It's in the field. And then follow up on prior observations. So, and I would say prior observations and discussion items. One pet peeve of mine was always, as investigator, was situations where 483 items were kind of closed out, but then there would be reoccurrence of discussion items. And typically that means when the discussion items keep coming up, then they usually bubble up to 483 items. So it's important to address both items. Typically what we've seen is with new products to market, so if changes are inadequately controlled to these newly marketed devices, it often leads to complaints or service repairs, or an increase of like corrections and removals under, and sometimes those are masked under design enhancements. So just need to be careful when you see those items as part of this, and that's why we come back in that 8 to 12 month period where we can look at the rest of the picture holistically. So pre-market approval inspections over the last 6 years. So kind of peaked up in 2017 and kind of has dropped off in 2018 and 2019. 2020 and 2021 are anomalies, largely due to the pandemic and many of the travel restrictions that were in place. You can see though in 2022, the pre-approval inspections, both domestically and foreign, as well as the post-approval inspections have started to pop back up. So, and we expect that trend to continue as we've kind of gotten out of some of the travel restrictions and adjustments to both manufacturers and industries business as well as FDA. So for some additional information, I'm going to provide additional references. 21 CFR Part 820, the preamble to the QS regulation final rule. I find this a great document because it gives thinking behind the regulation. The compliance program, 7382.845, and that's for inspections in general. The quality system inspection technique guide, and then there's also a guidance document for pre-market application reviews, which is listed here. And then the review and inspection of pre-market approval application manufacturing information and operations as well. Okay, so and then my contact information is here. Again, I'm part of the regulatory inspections and audit teams. Specifically, my area of focus now is the medical device single audit program. But happy to answer any questions. And I do see, pending any time, I think we still have about.
You've got 10 minutes left, Jacob,
10 minutes,
and there
okay.
are three questions in the Q&A as of now.
Okay, so if I'm looking at the Q&A, so the last, I'll take the last one first here. It's regarding what do we look for in terms of MDR procedures and processes. So there's a requirement to have a MDR procedure. The requirement is listed in the regulation, as well as the timeliness. So we're looking at two things. One, has the procedure been established? And two, have you submitted adverse action reports in a timely manner and correctly? So have you identified all the items that need to be submitted, including UDIs for those devices, to ensure that they've been submitted timely? That's always something that's going to probably be looked at during every inspection, even after the PMA, because it's incredibly important to know where we have device failures and where people get hurt. So I think I covered the first one, I think during when it came up, how do you determine which sites will need inspection, assuming a device has multiple sites involved in its production? So that's going to be done through the reviewer, through the request. It's very common that you'll have multiple investigators involved, one at each of the different sites through that process. But that's going to be, it's case by case depending on what they need to look at and depending on what's done at each of those locations. Design is typically always looked at. Typically, a domestic sterilizer we would not necessarily need to go to, but it's again case by case. So that would be done through the request of the review team, and you would know that up front. So conclusion of the IDE and the inspection. So is it to make changes? So in many cases, the changes done anytime that you've changed something, especially significant between when the review goes out for a PMA and then the inspection would be of concern because the reviewer wouldn't be aware of it to know, because they're looking at the package holistically to know if there would be any other problems. So that should always be communicated to the reviewer, and typically any major changes would be done through a supplement anyway. So that's one of the things that's going to be looked at by the investigator is, was there anything that should have been submitted on a supplement that was not, and that would pop up as a 483 item. So the next one was electronic copies. So there's definitely a push for electronic copies of the documentation. I think it's case by case of what's being asked for. Typically, it should be for the records they need, at least by the investigation or during the inspection. Electronic is definitely becoming the preferred method for collecting the documents. It's easier than for the manufacturers typically, and easier for the investigator. But the entire TMF, I'm not sure. I think it would depend on the case. So without knowing, I don't think that it's the preferred pathways to get everything, the entire electronic copy. Usually it's what they need, but again, case by case of what they're looking at. Common question FDA has during this process. I'm not sure if I'm tracking what the question is. I think during the inspection process, I really think it's ensuring that the process validations are in. You need to be running as if you're making it, not, you need to be out of the bench sample, engineering sample situation. So I think that's kind of the common theme that I would say is making sure that it's ready to be processed completely. So as far as, so this last one, as far as what conditions would require the contract manufacturer partner to get inspected for a specific PMA, I think it depends on a few things. Depends on the inspectional history of the contract manufacturer or partner, and I think it would depend on the risk. So that would get determined by the review team whenever they would issue it out. Again, the inspectional teams are going to be looking at each of the areas, but we're definitely going to be looking at, are the supplier controls in place to address it, and then whether or not the contract manufacturer or partner gets its own is largely going to depend on the inspectional history of that partner and what is the risk of the device being produced. Any other questions, concerns? If there are, my email is here. I'm happy to take any, and then we'll also I'll be back for, I think it's 12:45 for the question and answer session there as well.
Well, thank you so much, Jacob, for such an informative session. If there are no other questions, I think we are going to continue to move forward. Tony Blank, if you are ready and available to get started. Tony Blank with AtriCure is now going to speak to us about dealing with the unexpected. So thank you, Tony. Thank you,
Good
Jacob.
morning. Good morning, and thank you. Let me pull up. So by now, I think you've perhaps been overwhelmed or possibly been overwhelmed with all the things that happen or need to happen as you are doing the work to prepare a PMA application. Just heard about pre-approval inspections. There's a lot of animal work. Typically, there's a lot of bench work. Almost always there's clinical work. And the truth is, there will be, and these are multi-year programs, developmentally, sometimes 5 or more years. And the truth is that unexpected things can and do happen during the development of a product that is going through the PMA process. So I have some quotes that I like to keep in mind when I'm thinking about unexpected things that happen. First, very famous one with from Oscar Wilde: "To expect the unexpected shows a thoroughly modern intellect." David Vallee: "No matter how much we think we understand the process of nature, nature can always do something a little different, a little unexpected. It makes you realize how small we are." And of course, the eponymous Mae West: "Those who are easily shocked should be shocked more often." All right, so the realities of device development. Highly technical, it's complex, whether we're talking about the design of the product or the challenges related to manufacturing products. I mean, inevitably, we're talking about incorporating new technologies or taking existing technologies and creating new applications for existing technologies. And the truth is that there are very likely limitations that exist in various methodologies that we're going to be applying, whether it's in the models that we're using on the lab or the animal models. What I mean by that is there are limitations if we're deciding to do our animal work in a pig model. Pig model, very common model used for cardiovascular devices. There are a lot of physical similarities, but there are a lot of differences too. And so understanding the model is very important because where the model is appropriate, where the model is not appropriate, when things happen in an animal model, what's our process for really trying to dissect, excuse the pun, whether or not it's something that is devastating to the product development design, or is it something that happens because we're doing the work in a live model. Clinical studies, inherently risky. There's huge variabilities in patient populations. We try, when we're designing clinical trials, we try to account for and accommodate the heterogeneity of the patient population. But the truth is, sometimes there are differences within patients that we had not accounted for that results in sometimes surprising results. So, where do these unexpected things come from? As I've already mentioned, animal laboratory testing. You could see variability in your manufacturing process. Clinical study outcomes could be unexpected. Perhaps you're seeing the effectiveness that you had hoped to see, but maybe you're seeing an odd safety signal that you had not anticipated. The expectations evolve, the science evolves. Inevitably, when we're working on a product that is destined for a PMA application, we're talking about a product that is perhaps revolutionary, perhaps new technology, perhaps new applications of existing technology. And the thinking in terms of the science of that evolves over time. I've personally been involved with a number of circumstances where I've seen that happen. Most recently not most recently, but one example is what at the time was the evolving scientific perspective with regards to drug-eluting stents. I saw this when we were pursuing the first approvals for LASIK surgery. So the science evolves, as does the regulatory expectations, either as a result of the evolution of the science or just a re-examining of the potential benefit and risk to patients. I don't know if you've had the discussion yet on advisory panels, but if you get some adverse advisory panel recommendations or comments, that can be unexpected and something that you'll have to address. And then, of course, after you've put the product into the marketplace, you may see things in the marketplace, so-called the post-market experience, that are unexpected, that will challenge you. So let's talk a little bit, dive deep a little bit into the types of unexpected findings you might see in laboratory and animal studies. You might see device failures under extreme conditions. So maybe you're developing a permanent implant and all of the regular bench testing went fine, but you decide to test it at the design limits, and suddenly the devices are failing, and failing spectacularly, failing in such a way that if they were to fail in that way, when implanted in a patient, could be devastating to the patient. So there are a lot of challenges when that happens. You may see some adverse findings in the safety outcomes in an animal study. That can be a real challenge because you don't know, is it because there's something inherently unsafe about the device, or is it because we're doing the study in an animal model that is not human? So really trying to ascertain the meaning and relevance of the outcomes. And then, of course, you can see some unexpected findings during your efforts to validate your manufacturing process. So in all of these circumstances, dealing with these really begins with, as much as possible, your understanding of the strengths and the limitations of the systems and methods that you're using to do the testing. And then really doing an honest and, as best as possible, unbiased assessment of the applicability of these findings to patients. With regards to clinical outcomes, certainly you may find yourself in a situation where the outcomes don't meet the primary study endpoint or the hypothesis. You might find something adverse in safety. Maybe you're seeing higher incidence of strokes than you anticipated. You may have seen device performance issues or malfunctions during the conduct of the study. You might see different patient outcomes based on patient subgroups. Maybe it works really well in one subgroup of patients, but not so well in another subgroup of patients. And that can be a particular challenge if you did not design the study explicitly from a sample size perspective to evaluate the safety and effectiveness in specific subgroups. So that creates a challenge. And then, of course, real challenge during evaluation of clinical outcomes is when you have variations in compliance to the study protocol or the conditions of performance related to the clinical study. You could see subjects who have decided prematurely to discontinue their participation in the study. That can be devastating if that happens a lot, for a variety of reasons. One, it certainly raises questions as to what are they reacting to that's causing them to discontinue their participation in the study. And then, of course, you're left with follow-up data that you don't have. And then you have to, then you're left with having to deal with that missing data because the patients were still treated. So you have to figure out a way how to accommodate for the missing data if you can. Other violations and deviations to the protocol. What if you have a number of or if you have an investigator that was not diligent in ensuring that the patients enrolled in the study met the inclusion and exclusion criteria? What if the investigator was not doing an effective job or was even not consenting the patients before they were enrolled? What if they weren't doing the necessary or required follow-ups, or they were doing the required follow-ups? Maybe they were supposed to do a test one way and they chose to do it another way. And then, of course, just missing data. These are all examples of unexpected or adverse events that happen during the conduct of a clinical study. I back away a little bit from saying they're unexpected because no one wants these to happen, but the truth is, if you're dealing with a clinical study, a large clinical study, you can expect there are going to be protocol deviations. You can expect there are going to be some missing data. So, from the very beginning, you should plan for ways from the clinical study perspective to minimize the impact of this, to identify when it happens as early as possible so that you can make corrections and so forth. But these are some examples of adverse or unexpected things that happen during clinical studies. Other things are that I would stress is it's important to understand when this happens, investigate it, and then critically evaluate the finding and assess the impact on the study and the data that would be coming from the study. Does this mean that we have to do some additional research? Maybe we should refine the patient population. What's the impact to our conclusions about the device? And I'm actually going to go through a scenario, and I'm going to invite you to participate. Very realistic scenario, which can kind of dissect how things can go awry just close this, when you're developing a PMA device and you're looking at the clinical results. Again, evolving science, standard of medical care can change, which can impact your control group. I was involved years ago in a clinical investigation in which we were, it was going back to a drug-eluting stent. The drug-eluting stent was initially approved for what we call de novo lesions, which are original lesions treating a blockage in a coronary vessel that is original, so it's not an in-stent restenosis. Back up for me, some background. So before drug-eluting stents, there were bare metal stents. You put these into a vessel that was sclerotic, had atherosclerosis, and it would open the vessel, and then over a period of time, the disease would progress, and then the stent, the vessel would eventually close up again, partially, if not totally, as a result of continuation of the underlying disease. That stenosis, or closure, or blockage inside the stent is referred to as in-stent restenosis, or ISR. So when we developed drug-eluting stents, the objective or the purpose of putting the drug onto the stent was to reduce the occurrence or risk of restenosis by suppressing the biologic mechanisms that result in stenosis. So when we first came out with drug-eluting stents, the initial clinical study was done in patients that had original blockages, partial blockages, that were not inside a stent, so not in-stent restenosis. And fact is, the devices worked very well. The clinical results were dramatic. And there was a lot of excitement and optimism amongst the interventional cardiology community about these devices. And they were readily adopted as standard of care over bare metal stents initially, and were placed not only in lesions that were representative or similar to the lesions that were studied in the clinical study. That unbridled optimism found clinicians putting them in lesions that were outside of the indications, and that's certainly the purview of the clinician, because FDA doesn't regulate medical practice. The companies, as long as they're not, you're not representing a safe or effective, you're not promoting it for that use, that so-called off-label use. Clinicians are free to do so, and there was a lot of that happening. And one of the areas where that became very common practice is the clinicians started putting these stents inside in-stent restenosis, so inside stents that were old bare metal stents that had restenosed. And that became very common. In the meantime, while that was becoming common, the company I worked for, the developer of the stent, we were doing our diligence. We were conducting a clinical study to look at the clinical value of putting a drug-eluting stent inside a stenosed stent. Now, the standard of care at the time was a procedure whose name escapes me at the moment. That's what happens when we get older. So what we were doing is we were randomizing in the study between the current standard of care and placement of a drug-eluting stent inside these stents. What happened was so many people, so many interventional cardiologists had adopted placement of drug-eluting stents, notwithstanding the clinical trial that we were enrolling, had adopted the use of drug-eluting stents for treating in-stent restenosis, that our investigators, and they were publishing on this, the investigators quickly decided that it would be unethical to subject patients with in-stent restenosis to randomization, because the current identified clinical standard of care was, in their estimation, no longer an appropriate standard of care. They'd already moved in their minds to treatment with a drug-eluting stent. So it became impossible to complete enrollment in the study as it was initially designed to randomize. So that's an example of an evolutionary change in clinical practice that you have to address, that you have to deal with, because it can compromise your program. We could have just thrown up our hands and let it destroy the trial, but instead we worked with FDA, worked with our investigators, and found some resolution. Point being, the environment is always changing, medical care is changing along with the technology, and you just have to be prepared for it. Likewise, the primary endpoint evolves. In other words, how we measure the value of our product clinically on a patient. You may go into a study thinking one thing, but over time, again, because of the evolution, if it's a new technology, new treatment space, there may be new thinking. you might be using a surrogate endpoint in the initial clinical evaluation that was identified as a good surrogate for outcome, but is no longer considered a good surrogate. Now you have a challenge, because now you're measuring something that is no longer held to the same value that it was when you initiated the study. The expectations for effectiveness can evolve over time. And then, of course, the understanding of how the disease progresses changes over time. All of these are examples of evolutions in the science that often that can really impact the development process for a PMA product, because it takes so long. It's a long process, so clinical science doesn't stop evolving just because we're developing a product. All right. During panel discussions, you may find yourself in a situation where the panel may be, and these are public meetings, panel could be very critical of the clinical study design. Remember, clinical study design, it's ultimately owned by you, the sponsor. FDA, if you will, agrees to it in the IDE application to the extent that it doesn't compromise health or safety of the subjects you intend to enroll. But FDA's approval of an IDE application or clinical study design does not represent FDA's position at the time that the data generated from this study is going to support a market application. They will convey to you in the IDE approval letter concerns they might have through study design considerations or future considerations, and ignore those at your own risk. But in addition to that, if you go to panel and you've gone through the clinical study and you're presenting the results, the members on the panel could find themselves criticizing the study design as not being valuable, and that's just something that could happen. Panel might likewise be critical of the data, how you've analyzed the data. They may disagree with the implications, or they may believe that there are implications of some of the findings that you haven't considered. They may express concerns about the applicability of the results in your study to the real world. And they may identify things that they're concerned with regards to post-market issues, the potential for off-label use, the training requirements, the skills necessary to really use this device. So again, another class of potential concerns or unexpected things that you just have to address. You might see some things in your post-market experience. You might see a trend in complaints or malfunctions that's adverse. You might see device failures during long-term patient follow-up in your clinical study. We might see some differences in adverse events between different populations of patients. So again, lots of potential things to go wrong. So here's a very realistic scenario, and I'm going to read this out, and then I'm going to ask for folks to weigh in and just share your thoughts on how you what the next steps might be, and what you think the impact might be on PMA application. So I think my first request would be of see, Noah, is it? That if you could unmute people so they can speak up when once we've read through this. So your company has just completed follow-up for the clinical study of your new permanent implant, and the results look great. Study met its primary endpoint. Clinical study report has been completed. One of the engineers in process development has determined that within current setting of the manufacturing equipment, the material of the implant will have an increased susceptibility to fatigue failure, permanent implant. Risk analysis has determined this failure would be catastrophic to patients. The engineering team has developed a change to manufacturing that will eliminate the possibility of failure. A review of records reveals that nearly half of the devices that were implanted during the study are susceptible to this failure. To date, no failures have been observed, but engineering is certain it is only a matter of time before devices will begin to fail. As the head of regulatory, you've been called into a meeting with the board to discuss the situation. In particular, they would like your perspectives on 1, next steps, and 2, the impact on the PMA application. So let's open it up. I'd like to hear some thoughts on what do you think the next steps ought to be.
We've got one, Ben Crystal.
Okay. Hi, Ben.
Hi there. Yeah, sounds like you might need to consider a recall in a situation like this.
So the product's not in the marketplace. It was during clinical study. So the clinical study is done. So all the patients have been enrolled. But you're right. If that would be the path if this product was on the market. But right now, the product, the devices that were out there have been implanted in the patients in the clinical study. Clinical study report is written. The next step really is completing the last module if you're doing a modular PMA and getting it into FDA. But you're right. If a product was on the market, that would be certainly be a consideration.
And since it's still in studies, you might have to report it as, I don't know, do you report it as an adverse event? It hasn't really happened yet.
Hasn't happened yet. So what do you think about, do you think talking with the FDA is something that should happen? And if so, when?
Sooner than later. Yes, it's potentially a significant problem.
If you'd like to continue participating, what are your thoughts as far as what you would advise the board? What should the next steps be?
But why don't we let some other people join it?
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
I see Courtney Lane has her hand raised.
Hi, Courtney.
Courtney, if you could go ahead and unmute, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know what I would do, but I think the very first thing I would do is go back to the engineers and make sure they're right. Really check that this is true and that this is catastrophic. That would be my first question, I think.
That's very insightful. Thank you. So you note that I specifically wrote one of the engineers in process development. And I can say this because I'm an engineer by training. We love to analyze things. And we definitely have strong
question
opinions. Please.
Is what do you do with the folks that are implanted? You may be looking at an explants there. So that's tough.
If you get to that point, yeah, that's something that you're going to have to talk about, right? What is the risk of leaving the device in versus explanting it? Now, I will tell you this scenario, as I said, is a realistic scenario. It's kind of a conglomeration of a number of things that I'm aware of that have happened in a variety of companies over the years. The circumstance with regards to having a device that could fail permanently implanted takes me back to many years ago to a particular type of pacing lead called the J lead. It was made by a company called Telectronics, one of the early manufacturers of pacemakers. And basically there was a fundamental fault in this lead that it was prone to some degree to fracture. And if it did fracture, you'd have this sharp, pointy piece of metal flopping around inside the heart while the heart's beating. And of course, if it were to puncture the heart, patient would bleed out internally. But there was a lot of risk in terms of pulling the lead out at the time. So that was a real circumstance. Other thoughts? So again, Courtney, I like, we should try to figure out if this is real. And how would we go about that? See some comments.
Then again, I think if you do your risk analysis, as you've identified a new risk, you need to do a full analysis on it with the team, not just the one person.
Yeah, I agree. All right, so let's say you decide, you go back through the process with the engineers, the engineering team goes through this and says, this is real. We agree with that assessment that there's a likelihood that half of them are going to fail. So what next? What about?
Do they need to know that I mean, I would think that you would need to update the informed consent, really let the folks know that the devices are failing and give them the information, that both the investigators and the patients, right?
I suspect some sort of revision to the consent would be necessary, not to ask for their continued consent to participate in having the implant, because they've already consented to receiving the implant. But if we're going to be asking them to do things that they didn't originally sign up to do, then we'll probably need to reconsent them. So for example, if after we've reviewed the situation with the investigators and our own medical experts, if we decide that we should put these patients into a enhanced monitoring plan where they come back every 3 months for a scan or something, maybe an MRI or a fluoro, well, patients would have to consent to do that. And maybe, implants, you typically consent patients for participating over a 5-year period. You might want to extend that. It's really driven by what is the medically appropriate next steps as far as protecting the health and safety of as best as possible of the patients that have been implanted. And then there's always the question whether or not, what's the risk versus benefit, going back to the J-lead example of extracting the device, removing the device. So maybe if the risk of keeping it in there is far greater than the risk of removing it, again, you need the medical people to weigh in, then probably, they might be recommending to the impacted patients that they should have these devices explanted. So, okay. Any other thoughts? What about the impact to the PMA application? What do you tell the board?
It does seem like you would need a fix and basically an amendment to the PMA, hopefully once it's fixed, and try and get approval for the device that's fixed. And I would expect the FDA may come back and want more clinical data or data to show that it really did work, right?
Yeah, it seems to me that I'm sorry, go ahead. What I was going to say is, it seems to me that you're going to need new clinical data for the revised version of the device.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, well, good thoughts, good discussion. Let me just show you what the thoughts that I wrote down. So the first challenge in situations like those, is determining the appropriate manner to react. Typically, folks will fall into one of two extremes: either A, immediately presume the new analysis that one of the engineers has completed is 100% accurate and predictive, and the physicians, patients, and FDA must be immediately notified, or B, immediately discount the analysis as an anomaly that cannot undo years of product development and no action is warranted. In my opinion, the appropriate response of a company facing this scenario would be timely, purposeful, and driven by science. If I were a regulatory person meeting senior management in the situation, I advise the following. Immediately identify a technical team to review the analysis, hypotheses, and conclusions made by the engineer. This analysis should be done in conjunction with the review of the current risk analysis. The objective of this review should be to determine whether conclusions drawn are reasonable. So, Courtney and Ben, I think you were spot on. In parallel, a team should review the protocol described follow-up plan, including imaging and frequency, to assess the likelihood of failures should they occur being detected at the scheduled follow-up. If not, and the analysis confirms the engineer's conclusions, then appropriate members of the clinical team, as well as the clinical investigators and any necessary outside medical experts, should consider what additional follow-up or possible actions might be considered for patients with implanted devices to minimize their risk. Fundamentally, the actions taken by the organization need to be focused on making timely, important, science-based decisions to protect the patients with the implanted devices. So that's your first objective, is protecting those patients as best as you can from harm. Those patients that are walking around with these devices inside. Regarding communications, you should engage the investigators to evaluate what, if any, steps should be taken to protect patients. If the analysis and hypotheses are confirmed by the team, clinical investigators will expect to be informed periodically on the status of patients in the trial. They'll want to know. In particular, they will be interested to be informed about the frequency, severity, and outcomes of fatigue failures in the clinical trial patients, as this will assist them in the continuing care and follow-up of other patients in the trial. The organization will be well served to establish a formal process for regularly communicating defined information with all investigators in the trial. And again, this could be a very large trial. You could have 30 investigators, encompassing hundreds of patients. With respect to FDA, any new information that alters the risk-benefit conclusions upon which the clinical trial was initiated should be discussed with the agency. My recommendation would be, presuming the analysis is verified, be to contact FDA and arrange a meeting to review the analysis and the action plan. In particular, any revisions to patient follow-up. With respect to patients, this will be driven by the analysis engagement with the investigators and FDA. Clearly, if the analysis determines that patients should have more frequent, longer-term, or more intensive follow-up visits, then patients will need to be informed and likely will need to give further consent. With regard to the likelihood or timing of PMA approval, my advice to senior management would be to come back to that after the teams have completed their analyses and initiated actions necessary to protect the patients. In general, if there's fundamental flaw in the design or manufacture of the product, it's fair to say timing and likelihood of approval with the current iteration of the product is in jeopardy. So, like I said, very real scenario, sort of a conglomeration of some things that I'm aware of and things that I've faced over the years in my history. And things that, again, not unlike what you may face something like this some point in your career. So when you do, I think it's important to determine the importance of the findings and when and how they should be communicated. So whether it's study subjects and investigators, do they need to be communicated to? Regulatory authorities need to assess the market status worldwide. What if this product was already in the market outside the United States? Going back to Ben's initial comment with regards to assessment of the potential for a recall. Yeah, that certainly should be part of the process. It's really important when you're faced with these situations to be thoughtful, calm, but move expeditiously and get the scientific and medical input to make the best credible decisions. You might find those resources within the company, but sometimes you have to go outside the company. And you need to develop a plan to address when you have findings like this, whether it's pre-market or post-market, and make sure that you put into place, if not already, key risk management and mitigation plan. So that's what I had scheduled to cover. I've left time for just open discussion on unexpected things. I'm always happy to share some of the unexpected things that I've seen in my career. Happy to discuss any unexpected things that you've experienced, or if you have any thoughts or questions, I'm happy to spend time entertaining them. So I saw ethically, I think we should be advising the patients of the new risks, irrespective of whether the company or clinicians think they should be explanted. If the new risk is different than what was presented in the initial consent form, which very likely it would be, then I do think you would be you should be advising the patients or the subjects that that you've become aware of this and that there is an increased risk. Yes, I agree. I see a note here, ask the engineers for a fix, question mark. If it's a real problem, yeah, that would certainly be part of the process, is figuring out a way to address it. Q&A. If you have a device under review and during that review you have to implement a change to the device user interface, what steps can be taken with the FDA reviewer? So so I think so first and foremost, if the device is under review, if you make a change, you can notify FDA of that change by filing an amendment. And if the depending on where you are in the review cycle, the amendment may, just so you know, the amendment, if it's unsolicited, which in this circumstance it would be, is likely to change the review timeline on your application. And it depends where you are. If you've already had your substantive interaction, in other words, you've already received the deficiencies from FDA and you make this change in an unsolicited way, then it's going to extend your review time perhaps markedly. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. If there's a real driving reason to change the GUI, the graphical user interface, then you should do so. But unsolicited amendments, you should be careful and be cognizant of the fact that it does impact review timelines. So I think to the specific question from you, Ben, it depends on why you're making the change to the graphical user interface. In most cases, what we tend to do, if it's not a real urgent change, we tend to wait and to implement those changes until after we've received PMA approval. And then we just move forward with an appropriate supplement. Other thoughts or questions? It's a quiet group.
As a reminder, you can add your questions in the chat, the Q&A, or raise your hand to ask them live.
Oh,
And Tony, there's one in the Q&A now.
right. Can you explain the result of the J-lead? See if, boy, this is going back many years. So they, and I may not be remembering this exactly accurate, but my best recollection is that the company, working with FDA, they developed a separate organization whose sole purpose was to monitor these patients and to answer questions that these patients might have, as well as to communicate with the clinicians that were treating these patients. Because, when these devices went in, a lot of times these patients, when you get a pacemaker implanted, they go on with their lives, and they may move around the country. So it's really imperative that you have a communication plan, and they know where they can come to, so that they're aware of what's happening and information that's available to them. And there is kind of a semi-continuous evaluation and reevaluation as to the risk of leaving these things in. I am looking at my phone right now. Let me see if I can just do a quick JLead Telectronics. Obviously, there are a number of lawsuits, as you might expect. Yeah, so they created this AccuFix Research Institute, ARI, which has an ongoing commitment to provide information and facilitate the best care for patients. In 2005, this is the 10th letter mailed to physicians since 1994, when the AccuFix leads, they were called AccuFix, were withdrawn from the market based on mortality and morbidity from protrusion of the J retention wire. This letter represents the patient management guidelines recommended by the Physician Advisory Committee at the November 7th, 2004 meeting. So at this point, they'd been having meetings for 10 years. Patients who have pacemakers implanted can live for a long time. Background information and clinical details supporting these recommendations can be found on the website www.accufix.com. And then you can kind of go through and read the letter. So they released a summary of the patient management guidelines, screening interval and technique considerations. So as I said, my memory wasn't as bad as I thought it was. They put together this organization, and they're regularly monitoring it and regularly communicating. So.
And Jacob, I'd like to invite you back to join us for the opportunity to ask you questions, as well as Tony. And as a reminder to everyone, you can post in the chat the Q&A or raise your hand to ask live. And alternatively, Tony or Jacob, if you have other scenarios or prompts for the audience that you'd like to go over, you're more than welcome to do that as well.
All right, so I'll raise a scenario for you, Jacob. Okay, so let's say the investigators have scheduled their arrival for July 1st, and on June 15th, the company has a process validation failure. What should the company do?
So in that situation, that would deem still a major deficiency. So they should delay their inspection, because it's good to notify that ahead of time. And what they would do is just push that inspection. So again, it would all go through they wouldn't have pre-announced yet, just because it's not that many days. But that should really be having the inspection. They're gonna have to come back out because those process validations have to be fully in effect. There needs to be an assurance that we've moved from bench samples and engineering samples to a production a process.
Okay.
And I did provide a little bit of MDR. It was one of I think Ben asked a question about MDR. The requirements for MDR are in 803, and then I added the guidance document link. It's fairly detailed and kind of in the thought process to go through it, just as a follow-up.
And there is another question in the Q&A. Are there fees associated with inspections?
With FDA inspections, no. It's different for ISO 1345. It's different for MDSAP certification, but for FDA, not above the registration and listing. That's already part of the requirements.
So Jacob, I wasn't here for your presentation. I apologize. If you were to summarize how you would advise a company to respond to a 483, what would that summary be?
So 483s, so it's really how I coined it before was we see what the observation was. We have an understanding of what it is, and this is what we're going to do about it. Was my quick and dirty. Really, it's I kind of presented four parts, and it's making sure that you have an understanding of the root cause, not just the symptoms that presented itself. That you've done investigation on your own to explore the kind of the extent of the problem. Is it here, or is it more systemic? And then what containment or corrections did you put in right away? What corrective actions do you have planned? What systemic corrective actions are maybe involved? And then what's the kind of the timeline and implementation for those things? And then the supporting documents that go with that. So the key is you want to provide as much information as possible, so that the reviewer has a good feeling that you have a grasp of what this observation was, and that there is a strong feeling that it's going to be handled in a timely manner, so that your review can continue on.
And would you recommend that the company identify in its response how they'll verify the effectiveness of whatever response they come up with?
Very much so. Like I think typically we've seen the responses include almost their full CAPA process. So it really goes into the whole corrective action, including if it's known. Sometimes in 15 days you don't know that, and it's a living document in some ways, because you're gonna find out a little bit more as you do a little bit more research, or as you start to implement some of the corrective actions. So as much as you know, and including verification, because that's important too. Because they might ask for additional documentations to show that you verified the effectiveness, so that they can go on and close out discrepancies, or depending on how severe it is, they might have to have a investigator go back out to verify.
Good. Thank you. All right, so here's a question. Have you come across any cases where the first generation device had a high probability of failure, although not catastrophic, but the sponsor was able to provide good mitigation risks and scientific evidence for a fix in the second generation implant? Is there any possibility for the FDA to allow continued implantation in clinical study using the second generation implant and PMA application to continue? I can't say I've personally run across that circumstance. I mean, if I play this back to you, you have a situation where Gen 1 has a high probability of failure, but you have a process for protecting the patients. So first of all, the process for protecting the patients, that very likely would change the protocol. So that would require an IDE supplement to implement. And I think it would be difficult to be successful just in that process of continuing to, if you know there's a high probability of failure, it would be difficult to convince FDA allow you to proceed implanting with that generation. So then you identify a fix, and then you have the second generation implant. So, and the PMA application to continue. So one of the things that you need to consider and address is the extent to which you believe it would be appropriate to pool the results from the first generation implanted patients and the results from the second generation implanted patients. And then proceed, obviously with the PMA application seeking approval for the second generation. Lots of interaction with FDA would be the way to approach this. Jacob, do you have additional thoughts?
No, that's not my area of expertise, but I would agree. This is, it kind of goes even to some what I said about the inspection. If things are very unique, very complicated, it's best to have those conversations and get the clarity. I mean, without a doubt, you're definitely going to have the amendments and supplements. It's part of this because there's multiple things changing, the design's changing. If you did happen to have a pre-approval inspection, you would need another one because the design is probably significantly different.
Yeah. And then following on, how do you go about defining an acceptable failure rate for your implantable device as a primary endpoint for your study that is also acceptable to FDA? That's the $1 million question. So go to the scientific literature. You have your clinical advisory committee or your medical advisory committee. You have your investigators. I mean, when you're coming up with the design of the clinical study, you understand as best you can the patient population, what their risk is if they're not treated with your device, and you figure out what is and is not acceptable. So as a real world example, there's a device, staying in the stent world, there's a device called a carotid stent, which is intended to go into the carotid artery. And that's for carotid stenosis or blockage or partial blockage in the carotid artery. There is a procedure, a medical procedure called a carotid endarterectomy, which is an open surgical procedure, which for most patients is a very low risk procedure and very well tolerated and very good clinical outcomes. Basically, they go in there and they clean it out, and then they stitch it up and you walk out of surgery with a Band-Aid. So if I'm developing a clinical study to evaluate a carotid stent, obviously the standard of care is going to be a carotid endarterectomy. And again, which has a very low adverse event rate. I mean, something certainly less than 5%. So last I looked at it. So so any clinical study that you were to come forward with, you would not accept an adverse event rate any higher than 5% for sure. So that would be an example, and thus make it a very difficult study if it's which it probably would be a non-inferiority study. So those are some of the processes you go through. You look at the current standard of care and look what's happening at the current standard of care when you're considering the justification. Now, if stenting had theoretically a much higher success rate in terms of effectiveness, then maybe you could justify a higher risk. But that's that's part of the discussion that goes on when you look at some of the proposed devices that are emerging for treating high blood pressure. Looking at the standard of care as a medicine, which has various levels of effectiveness and different safety considerations. So when you're considering some of the devices like renal denervation and so forth, you have to look at the relative effectiveness of what you think it's going to be, and that'll kind of help you set the bar versus the potential safety issues.
Are there any final? Oh, sorry, Tony.
I was just asking other thoughts, other questions. Super helpful. You're welcome.
Are there any other final thoughts or questions for Tony or Jacob?
Yeah, I would just say, congratulations if you're in the process of, working on a PMA product. It's, I forget what the actual numbers are, but the very small percentage of the applications that go to FDA are in fact PMA. So if you have the opportunity to work on an original pre-market approval application, it's great experience and a great learning opportunity and a very valuable learning opportunity. And I would encourage you to stick with it and go through the challenges that inevitably come and enjoy the fruits of your labor when you're ultimately successful.
And I think with what Tony was just saying too is it's usually multi-stepped. You'll have your clinical studies being investigated separately from your manufacturing, and then you might even have a contract manufacturer that has never been, who's a final device manufacturer that's never been inspected before. They would probably get looked at as part of this process. So you might have it's multiple layers, and they're all kind of happening at the same time, but on different timetables. So there's a lot of information going on. It's not that bad as long as you have your processes in place, as if you're ready to run.
And one of the benefits of having been doing this for a long time, I've had lots of experiences, both good and very bad. And we learn, in my experience, we learn as much probably more from the bad experiences than from the good. So let me just share an example that I think Jacob could probably relate to. So we had a PMA application that was under review, and clinical trial was fine. Great results, great outcomes. And we had prepared the PMA application with and had qualified 2 vendors for sterilization because we wanted the ability to sterilize in different parts of the country. And a member of my team gets a phone call from at the time OC, Office of Compliance, and says, hey, look, we're not going to be able to approve your PMA if you want to proceed with both sterilization vendors. And we asked why, and they said, well, sterilization vendor number 2, we cannot approve that the PMA with sterilization number 2 vendor in the PMA. And we asked why. So, well, we can't tell you that. So of course we said, thank you. And we contacted sterilization vendor number 2, and they didn't really know why. And long story short, they were on a path to receive a warning letter, a very serious warning letter from FDA. And FDA was not about to let us continue to proceed with them as a vendor, as a sterilization vendor. So not unreasonable, that kind of stuff happens. You know, it certainly raises questions about how well we were monitoring that vendor to, you know, kind of let FDA make us aware that that was pending. We should, you know, I would say that we probably should have picked up on that ourselves, but be that as it may. But here was the interesting challenge. So the company was very anticipatory. You know, the review had been going well with FDA. Clinical study results were great. So we, as companies often do, and you know, all the processes had been validated, build product at risk, meaning we'll build product, we'll put it in the warehouse, it'll be under quarantine at risk until such time that we're ready to, until such time that we have PMA approval and we begin shipping the product. Well, sure enough, we had about $2 million worth of inventory that had been sterilized at sterilizer number 2, that had been built at risk. And it was an opportunity for the company to learn that what at risk really means, because at the end of the day, you couldn't do anything with that product except trash it. Because in order to move forward to get the PMA approval, which we did, we removed sterilizer number 2 from the PMA application, and all the product that we had built at risk was now garbage. So something to keep in the back of your mind the next time you're sitting at a meeting and you hear people say, we're going to do this at risk. Because it's a term that gets thrown around. In my experience, it gets thrown around pretty easily, sometimes without a real appreciation of what that means.
Well, if there are no more questions, I think we can go ahead and transition to a break. Tony and Jacob, thank you so much. These were really informative sessions, and thank you for answering all the questions and facilitating discussion. So we're going to go ahead and take a break now, and we will return at 1:15 p.m. Eastern, where we will transition to the maintenance of approved PMAs. We'll see you soon.
Bye all.
Bye. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Monica Montanez from NAMSA will now join us once again to discuss the care and feeding of approved PMAs. Thanks, Monica.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to present the care and feeding of approved PMAs. Congratulations, your PMA is now approved. Now what? Before we get started, let's talk about the current environment with FDA. FDA's view of changes is very conservative. Few changes qualify for annual reporting. There are several working groups, such as AdvaMed and RAP's Regulatory Open Forum, where industry and FDA have been meeting to discuss appropriate reporting criteria. This generated multiple updates to FDA guidance documents, which were recently released. So I highly recommend that you refer to these guidance documents for detailed information. FDA has been driving consistency, same type of change treated the same way across industry, and they're trying to assure equity in the form of user fees. This has become a very significant revenue stream for FDA. For example, 30-day notices currently are over $7,000. Real-time reviews are almost $31,000. So pre-market approvals, also known as PMAs, are the highest risk devices. Class 3 devices are those that support or sustain human life, are of substantial importance in preventing impairments of human health, or with a potential for unreasonable risk of illness or injuries. Since these are high-risk devices, they are unable to rely on general and special controls to reasonably assure safety and effectiveness. PMA devices have post-approval controls, that are mandatory conditions requiring a PMA supplement for certain changes, periodic annual reports, MDR reporting. The approved PMA may require other post-market controls, such as post-approval studies, device tracking, and post-market surveillance. More details about these controls will be discussed in the next few slides. First, let's talk about the post-approval studies, which may be required at the time of approval as a condition of approval. The PMA approval order will state the reason or purpose for such a requirement, the number of patients to be evaluated, the reports required to be submitted. An example of a post-approval language is found in the PMA approval order and is provided in this presentation. There are distinct differences between a post-approval study and a post-market surveillance order under Section 522 of the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, which may be required at any time after PMA approval. So now let's talk about post-market surveillance studies, which FDA has the authority to require these types of studies for Class 2 or Class 3 devices that meet any of these criteria. Number one, failure would be reasonably likely to have serious adverse health consequences. Number two, expected to have significant use in pediatric populations. Number three, would intended to be implanted in the body for more than a year. Number four, intended to be life-sustaining or life-supporting device used outside a device user facility. And some examples of this are TMJ devices, implantable pacemakers, metal-on-metal hips. Next, let's talk about device tracking. Manufacturers are required to track certain devices from their manufacturing through distribution chain when they receive a separate order from FDA to implement a tracking system. The purpose of this tracking system is to ensure that manufacturers of certain devices have established tracking systems so they're enabled to them to promptly locate that device in commercial distribution. So tracking of medical devices augments FDA's recall authority in order to mandatory recall in the case of serious risks to health presented by the device. Some examples of these devices would be defibrillators, pacemakers, pulse generators, ventilators, AAA endovascular grafts. Medical device reports are required to be reported within 30 days or 5 days if a manufacturer becomes aware of information that reasonably suggests that the device may have caused or contributed to a death or serious injury, or has malfunctions and such, or a similar device marketed by the manufacturer would likely to cause a death or serious injury if the malfunction were to reoccur. Next, we're going to discuss PMA amendments. And what are they? They're time-sensitive updates that do not affect safety and effectiveness. And some examples include the release of final labeling after PMA approval, a change in ownership, or a change in contact information, such as a company name, official correspondent, address, or a voluntary market withdrawal or recall involves removing products from distributor inventories and storage shelves and effectively notifying customers of the risk. Any modification required for a pending PMA or pending PMA supplement is also included in this type of report. Now let's move on to the topic of PMA annual reports. Periodic annual reports, also known as what I lovingly call PMA annual reports or periodic reports, is found in the PMA approval order as depicted here in this presentation, and are submitted each year on the PMA anniversary. approval anniversary. The PMA annual report should contain various sections, and the contents should include the number of devices shipped or sold, and if implantable, the number implanted. A list of changes previously submitted as PMA supplements or any other changes not previously submitted, and a summary and bibliography of published and unpublished reports. FDA also has the option to retrospectively require PMAs for changes filed as annual reportable. And so when they're reviewing your annual report, they may identify changes that should have had a prior approval submission and request that those be filed immediately. Sponsors also have the option to provide additional justification or submit the supplement. Generally, you only have one chance to make your case. FDA is not enforcing suspension of your manufacturing, and usually there's no recall or withdrawal in these scenarios, but they have the ability to do so. So the key takeaway for this is your change description within your annual report is critical. The PMA annual report includes a description of any changes that was not previously reported or made by the company. Examples of changes that are acceptable in an annual report are a qualification of an alternative supplier or non-critical material service or component. So your specifications should not change in this case. An increase in sample size in quality control testing or number of products sampled for final release testing, and tightening of a manufacturing process parameter are examples. The number of and type of changes reported are dependent on the company's business risk views. If your company's more aggressive, that equals more changes in your annual report. If FDA agrees with your company's non-reportable decision, the company will receive a letter from FDA requiring a supplement to be submitted to FDA. Again, FDA continues to practice enforcement discretion, although technically they could classify your device as adulterated under a strict interpretation of the statute. So the result equals cease distribution until the change is approved. As we move ahead now, let's look at PMA supplemental submissions. When are they required? Again, when a proposed change to a PMA, approved PMA, affects the safety or effectiveness of the device. For example, changes to a 510(k) cleared device requires submission of a 510(k) notice only if the change could significantly affect the safety or effectiveness of the cleared device. In contrast with the PMA, any change that affects the safety or effectiveness of a PMA device, whether it be positive or negatively, will trigger a PMA supplement of some type. So changes made to a PMA device that do not affect safety or effectiveness are generally reported in your annual report. So what types of changes qualify for a PMA supplement? Well, of course, the new indications for use would be number one. Labeling changes are also included. The use of different manufacturing or sterilization facility, any changes in your manufacturing methods or quality control procedures, sterilization procedures, changes in packaging, changes in performance or design specifications, extension of expiration date of the device based on the data obtained under a new or revised stability or sterility test protocol that has not been approved by FDA. If this protocol has been previously approved by FDA, a supplement is not submitted, but the changes must be reported in your periodic annual reports. So now my favorite subject, changes effective safety and effectiveness, which is really the key to determining the submission type. All changes must meet the requirements of the quality system regulation under 21 CFR Part 820, including design controls, design changes, including a risk analysis, validation, and where appropriate, verification of the changes to design or the manufacturing process. I highly recommend referring to FDA's guidance document, modifications to devices subject to pre-market approval, the PMA supplement decision-making process, for additional information. It's highly recommended from me and others to incorporate that FDA guidance document into an SOP that's linked to your change order process, or whatever you call it. It could be your document change control process, to ensure these changes are properly assessed and captured in your quality system documentation. The key here is the regulatory decision process found in this procedure uses a series of flowcharts which you can extract from this guidance document. I call it flowchart A through F. And also, I like to have the companion instructions to complement those flowcharts to help the regulatory affairs specialist through the logic scheme necessary to arrive at a regulatory decision. These flowcharts cover the major types of changes or reasons for making changes to an approved device. The flowcharts and companion instructions should be used in conjunction to arrive again at that regulatory decision. So, and please keep in mind, the flowcharts and the guidance doesn't necessarily provide all the scenarios that are needed. So as I learn through my submission process with FDA on a particular device type, I update this document accordingly because I've learned what falls under a specific submission type. Moving on, this slide provides PMA application type and how it correlates to FDA review times. So you'll see here we're going to be talking about panel track, 180-day manufacturing change supplements, real-time supplements, and special changes being affected. And on the right-hand side, you can see the review times associated with those types of application types. This slide depicts the PMA supplement user fees for each PMA application type. Note that the standard fee versus the small business fee differences. There's a small business designation that can only be granted to companies with sales of 30 million or less. And if this is your first PMA as a small business, the fee is waived for your first PMA. FDA has created several different submission types to address the wide spectrum of possible changes, and each has its own unique content requirements and process timelines, as we depicted earlier. Some are clear, others may require a pre-submission dialogue with the branch. Initially, I contact the branch lead reviewer via an email before jumping into the pre-submission dialogue. But some of the types of submissions that may require this type of conversation is a 180-day supplement versus a real-time supplement, a special supplement, changes being effective. Coming up, we will be discussing the PMA special supplement changes being affected. They're available in limited circumstances when the modification enhances the safety of a device or its use. It's a very narrow exception to the general rule of prior FDA approval of changes to a PMA. No design changes are allowed with this particular type of supplement and can only be used when there is newly acquired safety information. And this information is not previously submitted to FDA. So this information normally involves labeling changes that add or strengthen contraindication or warning or precaution, and concerns of adverse reaction for which there is reasonable evidence of causal association. Most appropriate, again, for labeling changes, can be used for manufacturing changes to enhance safety, such as quality control or manufacturing process to add a new specification or test method, or provides additional assurance of purity, identity, strength, or reliability of the device that improves safety, but do not impact effectiveness. I have to emphasize again, design changes are not appropriate for this type of submission. It may be placed into effect by the applicant prior to the receipt of a written FDA order approving the supplement. So generally, in practice, FDA requires that they agree before this type of supplement is filed. And of course, this, just to keep in mind, the supplement can be used in conjunction with the field action if the correction is labeling, specifically off-label safety use, which is rarely used. So we have seen special changes being effective. Now let's look at real-time review PMA supplements. There are 4 minor changes supported by only preclinical and animal testing with no new clinical data. It involves review within a single scientific discipline rather than a multidisciplinary review. Prior to submitting, you must obtain concurrence from FDA review team. And these types of changes may include device design changes, software, instructions for use, for changes with warnings, precautions, or other labeling that does not affect the indication or contraindications, and sterilization and packaging procedures. So what qualifies as a real-time review supplement? The changes is of a type expected for that device, and the change has been validated according to scientific principles, such as an accepted test method for that device, or if you've used an FDA recognized guidance or standard. The change is adequately supported again by preclinical or animal testing without the need of clinical data. And it typically involves review of only one scientific discipline as opposed to multiple. And FDA tries to and expects to complete that review within 90 days. So the real key consideration is to have a straightforward change with a well-established evaluation paradigm. So let's talk about 30-day notices. But before we go into that, I want to emphasize that PMA supplements are required for any change to an approved PMA device that affects safety and effectiveness, unless, in this case, such change is a modification in a manufacturing procedure or method of manufacturing. So this particular type of change may qualify for a 30-day notice. When FDA finds a 30-day notice inadequate, they kick it up to a 135-day PMA supplement. So you really want to ensure that your change, you have a straightforward change as well as a well-established evaluation paradigm. So what are some examples of this type of change? What qualifies? Purchasing controls could be one. Sterilization type or process parameters within the same facility is another. Any automated existing processes. If your joining processes are changing where the properties of the new adhesive are well known and not considered to be a potential problem, where there's a different solvent or energy source is used to join those parts. Changes in cleaning methods used to remove manufacturing materials. Manufacturing materials changes in those, as well as any changes in your environmental conditions of your manufacturing site, storage, or distribution facilities. changes in your supplier of components or materials, where, of course, your specifications do not change. And in practice, it's generally reserved for relatively minor manufacturing changes. You may want to consider, of course, reaching out to the agency to talk about any changes that are not clearly outlined in FDA's guidance document, because believe me, not everything is in those guidance documents. So, of course, the key consideration here is to ensure internally that it's critical to differentiate and align internally on the manufacturing changes versus design changes. So let's talk about manufacturing site changes. That is a PMA supplement, and a PMA supplement is required for these types of changes, or establishment to manufacture, process, or package the device. So these site changes are considered 180-day PMA supplements. These review times, of course, can depend on the amount of information that's required or that you need to submit in these types of supplements, and whether a successful inspection is necessary for approval. This supplement must demonstrate compliance with the quality system regulation, because a lot of these manufacturing changes, you have to requalify your move to a new site. So pre-approval inspection may be necessary depending on how much is moved and how large. From a strategy perspective, certain site changes that may be candidates for 30-day notices versus site change supplements. And here's two examples to consider. If you're moving manufacturing processes or packaging activities for a finished device from one site to a relocation site, both of which were approved in the PMA for that device, and if the move activities are already conducted at that relocation site for the same or similar device, will qualify for a 30-day notice. The next example is if you're moving manufacturing processes and packaging activities for a finished device from one facility to another, and they have the same establishment that has the same FDA establishment identifier, that also qualifies as a 30-day notice versus a site change. So now we're focusing on 180-day supplements, and when are those appropriate? Well, in this particular case, 180 days are appropriate for certain types of significant changes that affect safety and effectiveness of the device. It's typically used only when new preclinical testing is necessary, and it's generally considered appropriate when key clinical data from the original submission is still applicable. So you shouldn't have any new, the changes shouldn't impact your clinical study, in other words. Examples of the changes that may be candidates for 180-day supplements is a change in your principle of operation. Control mechanism, any changes there, changing your device, for example, from a manual to an automatic. Changes in your design or performance with that particular device, and labeling, and any new testing requirements or acceptance criteria that may not have been in your previous PMA. So now let's talk about the differences between a traditional PMA and a panel track supplement. The term panel track supplement means a supplement to an approved pre-market application, and a pre-market report under 360E of the title that requests a significant change in design or performance of the device. The real question here is typically the data that will support the change, not necessarily the type of submission required. So it can be under FDA discretion here. And some of the key considerations are you're most likely performing a major alteration to your indications for use, and of course, considering the ability to leverage data from your original PMA. Now let's talk about strategies for PMA supplements. My favorite part. FDA approval utilizes the quickest, most appropriate PMA approval approach. The company does not have to distribute commercialized product or product modifications under PMA approval. The prior baseline remains approved unless the change is driven by a field issue or recall, where continued distribution of the unchanged baseline may be considered adulterated product. It's possible to submit all changes as alternative option, and also consider may be able to split a larger change into smaller pieces, such as a sub change with its own specific regulatory strategy. For example, company A wants to simultaneously change a manufacturing process and update their labeling. This type of submission, if it was combined into one submission, it would be a 180-day submission, PMA supplement. An alternative path would be to submit the manufacturing change via a 30-day notice, and then separate the labeling change into a real-time supplement. Both approvals complete within 90 days versus the 180 days. Now I'm switching gears to talk about the recently released FDA draft predetermined change control plan for AI machine learning enabled device software functions. The scope of this guidance, and the reason why I'm bringing it up, includes class 3 devices, PMA devices, though the guidance main focus, from what I've been able to read, has been entirely on class 2 devices. So while a majority of these are class 3 or class 2 devices are being reviewed by FDA today, the predetermined change control plan is most critical element for any adaptive AI machine learning algorithm. This guidance does not seem to provide guidance and examples related to PMAs. And if you recall, we discussed the differences between changes related to 510Ks as compared to PMAs. PMAs require, of course, prior approval submission criteria for PMA software as compared to those for 510Ks. Additional guidance and examples would be helpful in this draft guidance for changes related to PMA approved devices. I've applied this QR code here in this presentation if you're interested in reading my recently released white paper on the draft predetermined change control plan for AI-enabled device functions. So with that said, what are the predetermined change control plan requirements for a marketing application? And in this case, it would be for a PMA. According to the guidance document as it reads today, your cover letter should specify that you have a predetermined change control plan. There should be a standalone section within your marketing application, including a placeholder in your table of contents. You should also discuss this in your device description and any labeling or relevant sections within your marketing application. And finally, in your summary and safety and effectiveness document, you need to talk about the predetermined change control plan that you're proposing, and then finally, the FDA approval order will contain a statement about that plan as well. So in summary, today we talked about class 3 medical devices are subject to substantial regulatory controls after approval. Changes to PMA introduces various types of post-approval submissions. We talked about the annual report, the post-approval studies, the amendments, 30-day notices, and all of these PMA supplements, real time, special changes being affected, 180-day supplements, panel track supplements. Each of these types of submissions addresses different aspects of the post-approval activity related to the device. And finally, we did talk about the most recently released draft guidance on predetermined change control plans that could impact or most likely will impact your PMA submission. So I strongly encourage everyone to provide feedback to FDA on the draft guidance by July 3rd. So thank you for your time today. Appreciate it. Up next is Ken from FDA.
Hi, Monica. So you still have 12 minutes left. There are some questions in the Q&A if you either want to open that up, or I'm happy to read them out loud to you, whichever works better.
What is non-critical material? Is that non-patient contacting? Well, your design specifications should specify what is non-critical materials. And it most likely is non-patient contacting. At one point in time, FDA had identified that those non-critical materials needed to be identified. And again, look at your FDA guidance documents on, say, for instance, 30-day notifications, and they talk about materials in that guidance document. How long and how many years do you have to submit annual reports for? Is there a defined period? You have to submit annual reports for your device as long as your device is out on the market until it's actually retired. So your annual reports are going to be required every year on the anniversary of your approval order. Is there any case where a change in control mechanism would meet a 30-day notice? 30-day notices are for minor changes in manufacturing changes, not necessarily a design change. And a control mechanism, from my perspective, not knowing what your device is, would be related to the design of your device and not your manufacturing process. So I would say no. That would not qualify for a 30-day notice. Would an addition of a new classified manufacturing room, in addition, in an approved site, be annual reportable? I have to define what's a non-classified manufacturing room for me to answer that question. Next question was, does a 30-day notice mean that FDA has 30 days to review the change, or do you have 30 days to submit the change from planned implementation or something else? I'm wondering what is meant by 30 days and the timing when it gets submitted. Normally, you have to submit and receive approval within 30 days. The only supplement that you do not have to wait for approval is a special supplement that I spoke of earlier. When would you need approval for a change to a service process that affects the packaging or service replacement parts, especially including capital equipment? Change is not to the marketed device, but only for servicing once a customer for a loaner device. When would you need? I would assume that these are packaging changes and labeling changes. And you're talking about replacement parts. So you would probably have multiple changes here. So I would like to say that you need to go back to your quality system when you review the changes from engineering and discern what impacts that flow chart that I spoke of. which I highly recommend, because you could have one change in one area of packaging, which could also affect your labeling and other areas. And again, that's where we break down what all changes take place and strategize how to address those changes in various supplements. You may have an opportunity to break those down into multiple supplements, or you may not. It just depends on the change. That's the reason why I really highly recommend everyone take a look at the guidance document from FDA, because that's key. It depends on how that information is captured, because you can have engineering changes, but they may not necessarily trace into regulatory submission type changes. Manufacturing materials, I'm talking about manufacturing materials that are used in the manufacture of the device, not the device, not materials that compose of the device itself. However, FDA can look at that as if there's any residuals materials left on your device, those things need to be addressed. But no, I'm referring to manufacturing materials that are used to manufacture your device. Oh, okay, Karen, if a change on annual report is converted to another type of PMA supplement, for example, 30-day notice, is the product automatically classified as adulterated? And should the company place a hold on further distribution? Also, what happens to the product already on the market? You know, I've had situations where FDA has come back to me and said, guess what? You should have done a PMA supplement or a 30-day notice on something. I rarely have found where the agency has told me that my product's adulterated and that I need to place it on hold, but it's possible. It's a possibility. And I had to break it up in the submission today. You won't know unless it's a safety issue. FDA will reach out to you and let you know one way or another if you need to put your product on hold. But it's a rare situation. What addition of a new non-classical? There is no change in the packaging or labeling as far as distributing the product. It's only how a replacement part is delivered to a customer. So you are addressing replacement parts. Hopefully you've addressed that in the design of your device that allows for replacement parts. They should have their own packaging and labeling. It sounds like they do. Then if you don't have packaging labeling for these replacement parts, you need to go back to looking at your design control process and determining if you need to implement changes for this replacement part. And you probably need to identify it as a replacement part in your design of your product. So you have the proper packaging and labeling for this replacement part. So again, going back to your changes, your change control process, identifying what has changed, because what's changed now, it sounds like a replacement part hasn't been provided before in the past. And if it's something new, you need to address it as part of the design of your product, that it has that capability or is allowed that capability of a replacement part in your servicing of your product. Many manufacturers level the supplements for approved pre-market approval. humanitarian exemption submissions during coronavirus disease 2019. With the end of PHE, we have heard that there may be a transition period. In addition, there are some advocating to make some of these discretions made permanent, meaning some changes would continue to be allowed as annual reportable. Does anybody have the latest status? I have heard that you have to, with COVID-19, I know I was involved in a lot of activity there related to this virus, and the particular submissions at that time did not have to go through the full regulatory review to allow those products to be on the market. After COVID, now you're going to need to submit your a new application to be able to continue marketing that product. There are multiple guidance documents out there, and I apologize, I haven't kept up with them. But if you want to continue marketing your product, you're going to have to go through the regulatory process. If it's a PMA, humanitarian, whatnot, if it qualifies for any of those. But no, I apologize. I haven't been keeping up with the FDA guidances related to COVID.
Thank you, Monica. I think with that, we're probably going to transition over to Ken, and then we look forward to having you answer a few more questions at 2:30 for the Q&A. So with that, we're going to transition to the next session with Ken Skotacek on the CDRH Ombudsman's Office. Thank you so much, Ken.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ken Skotacek. I am the Deputy Ombudsman at CDRH. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our program and about the appeals process as well. If you also attended the 510K workshop, I have the same slides. I'll try to tell some, maybe some slightly different stories or jokes during this session than I did before. And I will also apologize. I live in Annapolis, Maryland, and today is the graduation ceremony for the Naval Academy. And every year they have the Blue Angels fly over the ceremony, and that happens to be about a mile or so from my house. So if you hear some loud roars or thundering and wondering what it is, it's the Blue Angels flying over my house. So, all right, so let's get started. My background, I worked for about 20 years in the medical device industry. I am an engineer, a biomedical and electrical engineer by training. So I started my career in the industry as a design engineer for some class 3 implantable cardiovascular products. I found that I had more interest in sort of understanding how the products interacted and worked at a sort of a more practical level than sitting in a lab or sitting in front of a computer running simulations. So I made the transition from hardcore engineering to what I describe as clinical engineering, is the interface between the physicians and patients that would benefit from the product and the engineering teams that designed, tested, and evaluated those products. I worked for 3 different companies, a large, what is now part of Boston Scientific, a privately owned German company where I lived and worked in Germany for a while, a Biotronic, and a small startup that began commercialization of their product probably about 5 years ago. And I found that I really enjoyed working in the industry and the impact that we have on patients' lives. But I happen to live in the Washington, D.C. area, and I was thinking about sort of the future of my career, and there happened to be an opening in the branch that regulated the industry that I came from. So I joined FDA about, it'll be in total about 15 years ago. I worked then in CDRH in a variety of different roles, pre-market review, compliance. I was enjoying the questions about different types of PMA supplements and annual reportable versus 30-day notices. I helped coordinate a workshop on that very topic many years ago. And then I've run a lot of special projects and programs within the agency as well, either in detail positions or in different permanent positions, including the most recent reorganization. I happen to be, in many situations, finding myself as the interface between the industry and FDA. and I found out about the ombuds role, which I'll tell you a little bit about in the subsequent slides. And I've been the deputy ombuds in the center now for the last 5 years. I also have a number of other activities, sort of outside activities, supporting innovation at the Health and Human Services level. I supported a program called HHS Ignite, where we brought in teams to sort of do problem solving in different things. And I'm very involved in the ombuds community. So I'm currently the co-chair of the American Bar Association's Ombuds Committee, and I'm an active member in the Coalition of Federal Ombudsmen and the United States Ombudsman Association. And that little picture there is to sort of signify that no matter who I'm giving this presentation to, whether it's internal FDA staff or medical device manufacturers, I've been sitting in your chair and feel the same pressure and heat that you probably do in doing your jobs. So again, why did I join FDA? I think I look back at my career and a lot of the career choices that I've had, and I always tried to sort of empathize and understand someone else's or some other team's perspective. And I think it's great when you try to know what people are thinking or know what's sort of motivating them. But in reality, unless you sort of jump in and you become, per se, the wizard in The Wizard of Oz, you really don't appreciate the nuances of the situation. So for me, I wanted to see behind the curtain, run the controls, and see what really happens at FDA. And it's been fascinating ever since. My guess is that many of you have no idea what an ombuds is or an ombudsman is. Frankly, I did not either. Again, I worked for 20 years in the medical device industry and about 10 at FDA before I ever heard of the ombuds role. The ombuds role is actually a Scandinavian word. I like to describe it as, if you think of the early Viking civilizations where they had established governments and different things, it was a way for you to express displeasure with whatever the government was doing. Ombudsman roles have existed outside the US for many, many years, but they became part of the US sort of culture in the 60s during some of the social unrest that was going on at the time. There are 3 different types of ombudsman. I'm a classical, sort of a governmental ombuds. There are ombuds at the state and local level. So we happen to have an ombuds in the state of Maryland and also in the city of Annapolis. And there are also ombudsmen in long-term care facilities and ombudsmen that either work in corporations, like I know the ombudsman that was the ombudsman at Twitter for a while, and they also work in universities. They handle complaints between students or between faculty. Again, but I'm more of a classical ombuds. In general, we have 3 standards of practice. We are confidential. I like to describe this as the ombuds superpower, because in many cases, people want to bring up an issue, but they're afraid of the consequences if they bring that issue up. And the fact that somebody can come to us with some concern or some issue, and we treat their inquiry confidentially, it makes it easier for them to bring it up and to share what they're really thinking and what their concerns are. We're also independent, so I don't speak for the center. I don't represent the center's policies or programs. And I'm also independent. I'm free to interact with other members of the agency, have interactions with FDA staff at all levels, and we also report to the highest level of the organization. So I happen to report to the Deputy Center Director of CDRH. We're also impartial, so we don't take sides. When you contact me, we're not going to automatically take your side, and I also don't take the FDA side. Some people describe it as multi-partial, where I try to understand both perspectives and help both parties find a path forward. It's much like a mediator. There's some distinctions between how ombuds are not always mediators or don't always act in that role, but most of what we're doing is facilitating conversations between the parties. Here's a slide that you can look at. You'll get the slides, I guess, after the program if you want some more specifics about what we do. But again, we're engaging people at all levels. We sometimes hear from consumers or patients that are unhappy with what the agency is doing or not doing. And we also handle internal disputes. Believe it or not, sometimes even FDA staff don't always agree on what the interpretations of the regulatory requirements are. So our role within the center is not a judge, right? Or I'm not an arbitrator. So sometimes people reach out to us and say, hey, I have a difficulty. I'd like to persuade you. And then after I persuade you that my opinion is right as the manufacturer, that I'd like you to go and overrule what the agency does or whatever decision they have issued. Again, we don't do that, so I'm not a judge or an arbitrator. Rather, I like to think of it as we're highlighting different things. We're shining a light on problems or opportunities to improve a situation. Or sometimes it might be more like a mirror where I'm providing you with some reflection about your situation and what you're describing and how the agency might not exactly see things from your perspective. A lot of what I do is much aligned with a book. This is a New York Times bestseller from probably a long time ago, 15 years ago or something. It's a book called Nudge, and it's about sort of modifying people's behaviors in different ways, in very subtle different ways. And I think a lot of what I do is either giving feedback and suggestions to you, the manufacturer, for you to be more effective in your negotiations with FDA, or for working with FDA staff to be a little bit more empathetic or appreciative of the manufacturer's position. And ultimately, we're just trying to have the two parties find a path forward. In many cases, I get a question about, I'm not sure if I want to engage the ombuds. I actually just had this conversation yesterday because they weren't sure what the ombuds process is. And the reality is we don't have a real formal process. Again, that's how it's distinct from a mediation. People come to us with a problem, and usually it means that, we're having a confidential conversation. You're explaining the situation to us. You might have some ideas of what the options are that are available to you. In some cases, part of my job is highlighting other options that maybe you hadn't considered, or maybe you have some options like you have a dispute with the center and your next step, at least from your perspective, is to engage the FDA commissioner. Yes, that might be an option that's available to you. I've never seen it used or never seen it be effective. So part of my job is also helping you understand what options are going to work best for you. And ultimately, we're just providing advice as requested, right? So I don't have any influence over FDA staff, nor do I have any influence over you. My job is just to give you some suggestions, which I think will be helpful based on my experiences. Everything can then stop there. It doesn't have to go any further. In other cases, people go beyond the sort of request for advice, and they have a request for action, and they actually do want us to reach out to other FDA staff. In those cases, I might contact the individual FDA staff or their supervisors or senior leadership within the center and try to understand what's happening behind the scenes. I might join some of the internal meetings. I wish you could enjoy those, join those internal meetings because you'd understand more about what the center is thinking. And then I sometimes join the external meetings between you and the FDA and try to sort of translate what's going on to follow up with both parties and sort of nudge them to have better and more effective communications. And ultimately, there's just a lot of follow-up conversations we have, nudging people to do different things. I had one sponsor recently. I don't know if any of you have used the CDRH portal, but there was a date in the CDRH portal that appears to be a typo. I'm not really sure if it is or what exactly the issue is, but it was giving them a certain due date for the file that say at the end of June. But the actual due date that they have to respond to is actually May 31st. They thought they had another month to conduct some additional testing. They might not have another month. So a lot of when people reach out to me, it's having follow-up conversations and saying, hey, we need to get back to this person. If we're going to force them to stick with the May 31st date, we probably should have a good rationale for that. If we have some flexibility to grant them a different due date for their file, but they need to submit something else to make that request, let's let them know and have that make them request as soon as possible. So it's just a lot of follow-up conversations with all parties. The Ombudsman program is not your first option for resolving difficulties. I joke that no one comes to see me when things are going smoothly. That means that we only see sort of the worst of the worst situations. In many cases, individual disputes are resolved by directly interacting with the review staff, their supervisors, maybe the division director. There are lots of other alternatives for you to consider. So the Ombuds program is not that first alternative. And again, we're not the only option. So we're not the first option. We're not the only option. And I'd like to emphasize that we're not the nuclear option. Sometimes people are just, they think of it as like going to the principal and somebody's going to get in trouble if they contact the ombudsman. And I can assure you that part of my style is developing relationships with FDA staff to have them appreciate that the manufacturer disagrees with whatever's happening, and they want to maintain a positive working relationship. They want to maintain a positive rapport with those staff. And that means sometimes it can be difficult to express their differences of opinion without offending the other party. So, and I've even had people that I've worked with, again, when I was in the early days of the medical device industry in the early 90s, when they wouldn't have contacted the ombudsman, except they looked it up and they saw my name there and they happened to know me, and then they reached out to me. But otherwise, even their company was afraid of going to the ombudsman. So again, it's not like going to the principal or some internal affairs where everyone's going to get in trouble. Our job is just to identify what the issue is and find a path forward. I'm going to give you a few tips that you can consider when interacting with FDA. Even if you put the best possible submission together, even if you have conducted all the testing that you can imagine, it's only natural for FDA to ask you questions, right? So they're going to potentially see things somewhat differently, looking at the exact same data and the exact same information and come to a different conclusion. So it's all part of the process. Don't be offended. It's okay. A lot of the questions we get have to do not so much with the scientific or the regulatory decision, but the manufacturer can't figure out exactly what's happening behind the scenes. And again, I understood when I worked in the industry and I met with FDA. We had the old office in Rockville on Shady Grove. Been to that place many, many different times. I thought I really understood what was happening behind the scenes, but now in hindsight, I realized that I had no clue how the review process works. And in reality is that in many cases, you're submitting your application, you might have some interactions with the agency, but you don't understand what's happening inside the black box, and you're just waiting for that decision letter to be issued. Ultimately, my job is to help potentially for you to understand what happens inside that box, or for someone at the agency to communicate more effectively with you. And again, sorry about the, they're flying right over my house, so. Also, I think one of the most common sources of conflict or disputes is a lack of shared expectations or unfulfilled expectations. One example is maybe in the breakthrough program or even in the Q submission program, there are lots of opportunities to interact with FDA. And sometimes in the guidance documents, it describes what you should expect in terms of the amount of interaction. What you probably didn't notice, it says, as resources permit. And as you can imagine, during and after COVID, sometimes resources get stretched really thin, or maybe one of the lead reviewers or senior staff within one part of the organization recently departed. Maybe they went to the industry. And as a result, it takes a little bit of time to get caught up or to stay on top of things. And sometimes if you expect a meeting, say within 21 days, and you can't get that meeting until day 75 or day 90, it can be frustrating. So if there ever a situation where you want to make sure you know what's happening, please reach out to the FDA staff, have that conversation, maybe set those clear expectations, or at least if you know that they're not going to meet a certain deadline or something else is going to happen, if you know it and you can plan for it, I think it puts you in a better position as a regulatory professional. A lot of times companies will come to the agency and they strongly believe in their technology. That's only natural, right? So when I worked in the industry, there were times that we might have been working on a file or a project for 5 or 10 years before we interact with FDA. And the reality is that we know and are so close to our project or product, it's like a baby. So I have 2 small sons, and I can't imagine anyone insulting my kids or saying my kids aren't beautiful, young, well-behaved children all the time, even though I know they're not. So it's not just about what you believe in your technology, but bringing data to the conversation. So I always reference this quote from Dr. Califf. I think he is adopted from someone else. In God we trust, all others must bring data. And I would only add to that and analyze and present it as clearly and concisely as possible. So just because you have data, if you just dump it on FDA and expect them to come to the same conclusions, I wouldn't want you to be surprised that they come to a different conclusion. So again, analyzing it and presenting it clearly, concisely is really helpful. I also want you to appreciate that the FDA and manufacturers have sort of a yin and yang in the universe of medical devices. You clearly know your device better than anyone at FDA, and you have lots of experience. You have, or may not have, expert consultants working with you, but you also have some limitations, right, in terms of how much time you have to get that product on the market and how much money you have in the bank to fund the project. FDA, I would argue, that has a different sort of resources. They have experience with a lot of other devices. So another manufacturer may have come in with a similar product in the past, and FDA may have learned something from that interaction and learned from the testing that was presented to them. Of course, FDA staff have to treat that information confidentially. They can't share it with you, but ultimately they learn some things that might be applicable to your device. We also have experts in pretty much every subject matter area you could imagine, but they're also juggling multiple submissions and trying to keep things up, keep on top of their file load. We always have new staff that are coming in, learning things. So just think about it that you're trying to work with FDA to sort of leverage their experience to learn more about your device. So if you're considering contacting us, I'll give you an if-when. The if is if you're not sure what your options are and you're looking to explore other options, or to see, maybe you have a list of 3 or 4 options, but maybe your general manager or the CEO of the company is saying option 1, that's the way we need to go. And you might disagree with them, but you don't really know who to ask. And you're afraid of asking the review team because they might give you some different feedback. So we give you feedback on what those options are and what ones we might recommend. Alternatively, if something seems just a bit off, like you had a meeting and you thought the prior meeting went pretty well, but this most recent meeting just seemed a little strange. Some people made some comments that were a little unusual to you. If something seems out of the ordinary, that's when I would suggest that you potentially reach out either to us or to someone else and try to figure out what's going on. Don't wait until you're on a path to not get your product approved or cleared for a 510K before reaching out. And I'll use this analogy. Pretty much if you watch a movie where the protagonist of the movie, they're on a train and there's something a little bit unusual. They hear like a slight squeaking noise, or there's a vibration, something's going wrong. It's getting louder and more noticeable. And then something else happens, right? And ultimately the protagonist should have reacted sooner to the situation, but instead they didn't do anything until it was too late. So if you contact us and you're like, we just got off the phone with the review team and they're about to issue a disapproval letter, and it's sort of the last day that they have to issue that letter, and then you call us and say, hey, we need to fix this situation. We need to get our product on the market. I can pretty much assure you that it's too late, right? That train has gone off the rails, is headed into a ravine. You have to try to intervene earlier to sort of redirect or fix whatever the problem is. And ultimately, there's a hard line for regulatory decisions. So before FDA issues a final decision on your file, you have many different options to interact, right? You can use the Q submission process. There's also interactive review. You can pick up the phone, have a conversation. You could interact with their supervisors or maybe division directors or even office directors. You have lots of options to interact with the agency to try to find a path forward. Once the agency issues you a decision letter, a final decision letter, potentially a disapproval letter, you don't have a lot of options. You basically have one option, which is to appeal, and I'm going to describe that in the next set of slides. So appeals are described in the regulations. Most people aren't familiar with these regulations because appeals are relatively rare for overall decisions. So there are 2 regulations. There's 21 CFR 1075, which is the FDA's appeal regulations. And there's 800.75, which was probably established maybe 4 or 5 years ago for CDRH's appeal process. There are 4 different primary appeal resources. So again, 2 regulations, 2 guidance documents. There's actually a 3rd guidance document on manufacturing mammography quality standards that probably don't apply to you as manufacturers, but so these are the primary resources. Ultimately, what you're going to do is you're going to reach out and send a communication and ask for someone at the next higher level of the organization to review the decision. So most of the decisions are issued at the division or the OHT level, and you'd find that from whatever description is in the signature block. And then you're going to appeal to the next higher level. It's basically saying, I used to use the analogy, you're on the phone with Verizon or AT&T, and there's a problem with your phone bill, and the person is saying, I'm sorry, sir, your plan has changed. We've doubled your price. You're just going to have to pay more. And you're like, I'm not paying more. And you can talk to that person for a while, and ultimately they might not give you the better rate. And you're like, hey, I'd like to speak with your supervisor. That's all that an appeal is saying, I'd like a supervisor to reconsider the information that's available to us and maybe come to a different decision. So there are two types of decisions for appeals. These are called out in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, Section 517A, describes significant decisions. It used to be called significant before 517A was in place. And those decisions basically are 510Ks, PMAs, HDEs, breakthrough designations, and IDEs. So they're all called out in the regulations themselves. There are lots of other decisions that the center makes. Some of them are obvious, some of them are not so obvious. You'll notice that the list is not limited to just pre-market decisions, but it's also compliance-related decisions and some ORA-related activities. You'll notice it's strange that de novos are examples of non-significant decisions. It's because the regulations for de novos weren't in place at the establishment of 517A. If you check on the guidance documents today, you'll notice that these documents are in the process of being revised because de novos will be moved to significant decisions. Also, you should know that you always have the option of requesting what's called a substantive summary. It's described in the appeal guidance, but in fact, it's just another way to better understand how the FDA is thinking. In most cases, it doesn't reveal anything particularly interesting that you don't already know, but in some cases, it highlights something in a different way that helps you better appreciate where FDA is, what's the basis for their decision. And although it's called out in the appeal document, you can request it anytime you get a negative decision. It's meant to sort of aid in the FOIA process. FOIA's Freedom of Information Act. You can always submit a FOIA request for the review memos associated with your file. The problem is that the FOIA process is so overwhelmed with people requesting information about 510Ks that the response time is between 18 and 24 months. So at least this request for a substantive summary would be given to you rather quickly, usually within 30 days. Ultimately, if you're going to submit an appeal, you're going to send it in to FDA in the same way that you submitted your original submission. You're going to make an opening statement saying this is an appeal, 1075 in the top. You're going to say whether or not you want to have an in-person meeting, a teleconference, or no meeting. I would always recommend an in-person meeting. The agency does honor in-person meetings now. And then what's the summary? What's your basis for your appeal? Make some specific request and provide some supporting documentation. The key point is that you can't provide new information in the appeal request. You're basically asking the supervisor to reconsider the decision that was made originally. So it's not really new test reports or new information. So importantly, you have 30 days to appeal. So you can't wait a long time. You have to make a decision quickly for 517A decisions. And for all those other decisions, you have to appeal within 60 days. And then the agency has 30 days to schedule the meeting. And after the meeting, 30 days to issue a decision. So it's at most 60 days total. Or if you don't want a meeting, you can get a decision within 45 days. Again, personally, I would always request a meeting. Overall, there are multiple meetings that occur within the agency. There are internal meetings that occur before meeting with you. There are internal meetings that occur after meeting with you. The only thing that you need to focus on here is point number 4, meeting with the applicant. If you go in for one of these meetings, you're going to see a large group of people There are people from all over this center that are interested in understanding, sort of what your basis is for a different opinion or requesting a different opinion. But ultimately, you're going to focus on one person, and that's the appeal authority or the review authority. And you're going to give a presentation. You get about an hour for the meeting. You shouldn't have your presentation be more than half of that meeting, and be prepared for lots of good questions. And everyone else beyond the review authority is just there to observe. Ultimately, there are three outcomes of appeals: decisions fully overturned, decision partially overturned, or the decision is upheld. In most cases, it's either the decision is upheld or partially overturned. But in all cases, I've found that the appeal decision letter, is more like a legal document, and sometimes it reveals things that weren't obvious to you, or maybe a better, more efficient path forward. And again, if you're considering appeal, don't consider it like the nuclear option, right? It's available to you. I think somebody was saying about 10% of all NSC decisions for 510Ks are appealed. My guess is that the number of appeals for PMA products is far, far lower, only because there are far fewer PMA decisions overall issued by the agency. And if you're concerned about retaliation, there's a non-retaliation policy at FDA. Ultimately, the staff aren't going to retaliate if you challenge the decision. Yes, they can sometimes take it personally, but part of my job, I just did that this week, was to help the FDA staff appreciate that, it's not whether they made the right or wrong decision. It's not a judgment about their performance at FDA. It's a judgment that the manufacturer just wants someone else to look at it and to make sure that they came to the right conclusion. You might have heard about the least burdensome flag. I'm not going to get into it too much here. It's in the Q-Sub guidance. You can't overturn a decision by other informal interactions, but there might be some insights that you gain from interacting, say, with a division director or an office director after that decision. You should always be aware that there are least burdensome guidances. A lot of times it's not about the decision itself, but about what data is being requested or what you need to do to get a positive decision. People refer to these guidance documents all the time, or least burdens principles. And there are benefit risk guidance documents for each of the decision types. So obviously for this workshop, you'd be looking at the PMA benefit risk guidance to understand how FDA is supposed to make its decisions. Ultimately, it's all about shared goals. It's not a competition with FDA. You're trying to just get your product to market and improve the public health. You don't always need legal counsel for appeals, although sometimes people that they feel they need to have legal counsel. I've seen appeals be successful in both cases with and without legal counsel. And just remember that you can't appeal non-decision. So if you ask FDA for feedback in a Q submission, you can't say, we don't like your feedback. You're just welcome not to use it. And there are lots of other examples of things that are not considered decisions that you can't appeal. And I think that's it. I think we're at the end of my time, and we're probably going to move to the overall group questions answers, I recall correctly.
Yep, that's correct, Ken. Thank you so much for your presentation. And I'd like to welcome back Monica to join you here for a few minutes of Q&A. And as a final reminder to the audience, you can do questions in the chat, the Q&A function, or raise your hand to ask them live.
So I see one for Monica that was probably at the transition point. Monica, do you want to take that one? With the addition of a non-classified manufacturing room in an approved site qualify as annual reportable? Classified. Any thoughts, Monica? Or you come back? There you go.
Here I am. Yes, I'd really like to go back to the idea. I know there's lots of questions related to changes. And if you recall in my submission, I talked about the FDA guidance documents for assessing those changes. So it's really critical for you to look at those charts, those decision charts. So you're going to be looking at manufacturing changes. So this sounds like it's a change in manufacturing. It could be a design change. It could be labeling, sterilization, or packaging, but in this particular case, it sounds like it's in manufacturing. So if you go to the manufacturing section, which I would call flowchart B, go through that decision charts and determine if this change would affect your manufacturing changes. And it sounds like it would, and there's various types of
Monica, do you want to
changes.
share your screen so they can see what you're looking at maybe?
Yeah, let's see.
There you
So
go. Starting. There you go. Perfect.
I talked about earlier about having a SOP for assessing all of these changes, right? So the key here is the change request assessment. So you've got your manufacturing engineer coming to you, asking you, can I add this extra room? So one of the things I like to say is you want to assess that change description from that engineer, clearly identify what's being impacted by the change, and have them provide you with a concise, thorough description of each proposed change. And once you know what that is, then you need to ask that engineer the reason for that change. You want to know why that change is taking place and why they need to have that extra room, right? So the change assessment is so important, and the reason for change and having a detailed background about the information to ensure that you have a clear understanding of why that change needs to take place. The next step would be a justification for that change. Why do you need that change? Please provide evidence that proves that proposed change is reasonable. It's recommended that change justification be detailed in that document change order. So if there's any documentation that the engineer can give you to support that change, make sure that's attached to your quality system document. Once you have all that information about what's changing, then that helps you make that regulatory decision process. And you can go through this SOP. Remember, I took the FDA's guidance document and implemented it into this SOP, which helps you explain to the engineer why this change may be a certain type of submission. As we all know in the presentation, a majority of the changes are either annual reportable or they're all supplements to FDA. So having this decision chart is very helpful in making that determination. So as I go through this, I even have a section here where I talk about the exception list, which talks about obvious errors and formatting and stuff like that, that would not even be submitted in your annual report. But then I move on and I talk about changes to manufacturing changes. Now this is pretty small, but I can tell you that I took this strictly out of the guidance document. I may have added more to it as I learned more about my product, but someone asked about a manufacturing process change, manufacturing site change. Here it would say it could be a 180-day site change supplement, or it could be a 30-day notice. And what would constitute a 30-day notice? If there's a change in environmental specifications, then this outlines what those changes entail and what they don't entail, what would be considered part of that change. Each of these decision charts will tell you this is an annual report, a 30-day notification, a real-time review, a PMA supplement, 180-day. But with manufacturing, it's either a 30-day notice or 135, or it could be 180. Hopefully that is helpful in understanding your questions, because the key here is to go back to whoever's making that change, which is usually engineering, and finding out all the details as to why that change is taking place.
So Monica, you're clearly the expert in this area. Maybe I could share an insight that I had working at FDA. When I first joined FDA, one of the first things that they have you do, maybe when you're at the bottom of the totem pole, is you're reviewing the annual reports for PMAs. And no one likes that job. And again, I joined FDA because I wanted to better understand how FDA worked. And I remember reviewing annual reports and I'm like, I can't figure out, is this annual reportable? Is this a 30-day notice? Is this 135-day? And we were getting multiple annual reports from different manufacturers for similar products, right? So it's a small industry. And what I found is that like half of the time we told the manufacturer that they had to say submit a 30-day notice. And
Yes.
the other half of the time, somebody submitted a 30-day notice and we told them you don't need to submit a 30-day notice for this. This is annual reportable. And I'm
Right.
like, this is crazy. Like you have to have a better way of tracking it. And what I found is the companies that provided a better explanation of the impact and that sort of walked through the rationale that you're describing, those were the ones that were able to justify the appropriate classification. When they focused on the change itself, but not the rationale, and it ended up going into the more intense review category because FDA was uncertain about the impact of the change.
Yeah, that's when the FDA would come back and ask you more questions about the description of your change.
Yeah. Also, I think, Monica, somebody asked you, are you going to share that SOP?
Sure, reach out to me. I'll be more than happy to share it.
That's great.
But do know you need to make this SOP applicable to your device because there's still some gray areas there. Just like the FDA guidance document does not cover all changes that may happen with your device type.
Great.
Disclaimer.
And then the other question in the chat or the Q&A is, what's the amount of time for the appeal process? So I apologize if maybe this question came in before I had that, or I went through it too quickly. So there are sort of two timers. There's the timer for the manufacturer. So if you're appealing a decision that's a significant decision, like a 510K, PMA, HDE, IDE, and soon to be de novo, you have to appeal that decision, submit your request for appeal, and have it be received in the Document Control Center within 30 days. For all other types of decisions, say you get an untitled letter or a warning letter or some other type of decision, you have up to 60 days within CDRH to request the appeal. Once FDA receives that appeal, they're going to schedule a meeting with you within 30 days. And in my 5 years in the program, we've never missed that scheduling. So even if people are out on leave or it's around the holidays, the meeting will always be scheduled within 30 days. And then within 30 days after the meeting, you'll get a final appeal decision letter that'll outline the outcome of the appeal request and the sort of rationale. Again, you could always request what's called a paper review. You submit something and saying, FDA, I'd just like to have the supervisor relook at the file and make a new decision. I've never found that to be particularly helpful. Maybe companies think 45 days is better than 60 days, but I would always request a meeting. And I would always also request a meeting in person. There's value to having a face-to-face conversation, right? That we used to have these face-to-face meetings all the time prior to COVID. They do occur now. There's not as many. I've been to the FDA campus. I think I have 2 appeal meetings on Thursday of this week, and I was in an appeal meeting last week, an in-person meeting. So request to meet with the agency in person and sort of make your case. It's helpful. Any other questions from the group? I know we have just about 5 more minutes, or maybe 4 minutes. Can you see the other question, Monica, about UDI?
Oh, actually, UDIs are separate submissions. They're not necessarily reportable. I mean, you could talk about UDIs in your annual report. There's a special section in there about future submissions. You can cover that in your annual report, but UDIs are specific to the UDI regulation. Do you agree with?
Yeah, maybe Monica, I don't know if there was a UDI focused presentation of the workshop. My guess it's maybe more of a nuanced topic that no one from the workshop touched on in any great detail.
Right. And I do know that, that's considered just prior to PMA approval. FDA usually asks for your UDI numbers then at that stage, when you identify those UDIs for each component or each part of your device. Having experienced that recently with a recent PMA approval. So that's kind of a separate system where you go and submit that data under the UDI regulation process. And there's plenty of guidance documents out there that'll help you with that.
There's also a, because we get all kinds of general questions across the center, so I'm not a UDI expert, but I know there is a UDI help desk, and the system to upload the information to FDA's system is not as simple as some of the
No.
other, user-friendly as some of the other systems. And sometimes people get stuck in a limbo of they're trying to send the information to FDA, but they can't get past certain questions or certain parts of that system. And again, there's a UDI help desk that you can reach out to. That's actually a third party. It's some contractors that will answer those questions and try to get back to you.
Yeah, they're actually getting better at it, Ken. We
That's
didn't
good.
have any problems uploading that information here recently.
Yeah, I think, Monica, you're probably in the more experienced camp. As you can imagine, there are a lot of manufacturers that are maybe don't have your expertise or background, and they really struggle with some of those systems. All right, no, I don't see any other questions, comments in the thing. Do you want to conclude now that we're at I think we're at time?
Yep, we're at time and I don't see any either. So thank you so much, Monica and Ken, for your insights and for your wonderful discussion. We really appreciate your time. With that, we're going to go and conclude today's presentations of the PMA Submissions Workshop. I want to express our sincere thanks to each of our speakers who so generously shared their time and expertise on the program over the past few days. Your experiences and insights are incredibly valuable, and we thank you for being here with us this week. Tomorrow, please join us from 12 p.m. to 1:15 p.m. Eastern for an interactive opportunity to apply your learning from the past 2 days. This is an essential component for pulling all of the pieces together, solidifying your understanding, and asking any remaining questions of our program experts. Please note there's a separate Zoom link for tomorrow's program, which can be found in your registration confirmation email. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you.